It always feels like a headwind when you're on that little bike.
You just can't get it.
Yeah. Any little wind hits it.
I tell you what, it's all relative.
My wife takes me to go out with her. My knees are so bad. But I can buy it while she's running. So I ride my mountain bike on all the trails, the canals, you know.
Right.
It's hard. Mountain biking is hard. It is, but no. Yeah. It's like, you know, it's like a pretty wide trail. Yeah. And those are, I don't mind so much. Yeah. But she takes me on some stuff that's, you know, there's also the power houses and the roads that go down to, and you need heads. So there's always a hill next to the power house. Right. Right.
Okay, everybody. According to my clock, it's 1:11, so we should probably get underway. Again, I'm Stephen Moore, hearing officer for these proceedings. And the next part of our proceedings, we'll let Peter get up here. Thank you, Peter. Great. We will now hear the Karuk tribe's opening statement and direct testimony of Leif Hillman, followed by any cross-examination in the order I previously identified. So, Mr. Hunt, please come up.
Thank you, Vice Chair Moore and the hearing team for addressing this important issue here on the yesterday, today, tomorrow, hopefully not too much past that. The Karuk tribe is participating in this hearing because Stanshaw Creek provides critical thermal refugia and other rearing habitat for coho salmon and other species that define their cultural identity. Protecting the cold waters of Stanshaw Creek is essential to ensuring the coho salmon have the habitat they need to complete the rearing portion of their life cycle before heading out to sea. For the Karuk, protecting Stanshaw Creek is tantamount to ensuring a niece or nephew has food on their plate and clothes on their back so they can successfully navigate childhood and adolescence and enter society as a functional adult. The Karuk people view salmon as a cornerstone of their culture. An unreasonable diversion from Stanshaw Creek strips it of its ecological functions and deprives the ability for salmon to complete its life cycle and return to the river year after year. In my mind, it's unfortunate that much of the testimony we've heard from Marble Mountain Ranch so far pertaining to fish and fish habitat has focused on a single observation on a single day, such as that from Mr. Kramer, or to a single fish kill event. This misses the point. Sorry, I lost my place. . This misses the point. The fact of the matter is that Stanshaw Creek cold water refugia must be considered in the context of the Klamath ecosystem as a whole, and its context in time. We know that coho and other fish rely on cold water refugia provided by Stanshaw Creek, in some years more so than others, depending on annual hydrologic conditions and weather variations. Although any given day you may find 1, 50, 100, 200 fish in the pond, that doesn't mean that's how many fish need or use that pond. The individual fish using the pond one day are not the same individuals using it, not necessarily the same individuals using it the next day, provided the pond maintains connectivity to the river. And this depends on Stanshaw Creek and the Klamath River flows. It depends on both. It's like a rest stop on I-5, if you could picture it. Although there may be 50 people at the rest stop at any given time, thousands of people use that rest stop over the course of the year. Stanshaw Creek and thermal refugia like that serve that purpose for salmon up and down the Klamath River. When Stanshaw Creek flows drop so low that the pond is no longer connected to the river, fish cannot leave the pond. They may not all die at that moment. Though they may not all die at that moment, they are at greater risk of predation. If temperatures rise, they are in fact at risk of thermal shock. If dissolved oxygen drops too low, they will suffocate. That is why maintaining connectivity to the river as well as the creek is critically important. In recent decades, and especially since the 1964 flood, there has been a loss of this sort of off-channel pond habitat in the Klamath as a whole. Following the 64 flood, many of these off-channel type areas were diked and insured to protect property interests, so where there may have been many in the past or more than there are now, very few remain. There are really not that many places like that left on the Klamath River, and that's why the Karuk are so adamant that this particular area be protected. To ensure the protection and our participation in the hearing, we also want to just clarify that we're joining arguments and issues addressed by the prosecution team, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, NOAA Fisheries, Old Man River Trust, the Klamath River Keeper, California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance, and the Pacific Coast Federation of, I can't remember what it all stands for, PCFFA.
Fishermen's Associations.
Thank you.
That was
Somebody-
the hardest one.
Somebody will clear it up for us later. So with that, I'd like to turn now for a moment to the two main legal principles underlying the questions in this hearing. The first is the reasonable use doctrine. Under the California Constitution, Article 10, Section 2, it commands that the waste and unreasonable use or unreasonable method of use of water be prevented, and that conservation of such waters, these are the waters of the state, is to be exercised with a view to the reasonable and beneficial use thereof in the interest of the people and for the public welfare. It goes on to state that the right to water or to use of flow of water in or from any natural stream or water course in this state is and shall be limited to such water as be reasonably required for the beneficial use to be served. And such right does not and shall not extend to the waste or unreasonable use or unreasonable method of use or unreasonable method of diversion. Shortly after this was adopted into the California Constitution, the California Supreme Court recognized that the rule limiting use to that reasonably necessary applies to all water under whatever right they may be enjoyed. This applies to pre-1914 rights, such as those asserted by MMR. And the reasonableness of a use and the method of diversion is not static in time. What was once reasonable may not be reasonable in light of changed circumstances. Whatever the reasonableness of MMR's water right may have been in the past, dutiful application of the doctrine of reasonableness compels a conclusion that the current use and method of diversion are not reasonable. Pursuant to this constitutional requirement and the Water Code Section 275, the State Water Board has the authority, and I emphasize, from our perspective, the duty to take action to prevent the misuse of water. The second legal principle relevant to the hearing is the public trust doctrine. Under the public trust doctrine, the state holds waters of the state in the public trust for the benefit of state residents. Again, this is applicable to the public as a whole, and it's all of our right that the state is responsible for protecting. The California Supreme Court has held that public trust doctrine extends to the preservation of water's function as natural habitat, not just the water itself. There's a potential conflict here, arguably, between public trust and reasonableness, but it's reconciled as such by the California Supreme Court, which in the Audubon case held that the public trust doctrine and the doctrine of reasonableness prevent any party from acquiring a vested right to appropriated water in a manner harmful to the interests protected by the public trust. They also found that the state has an affirmative duty to take the public trust into account in the planning and allocation of water resources and to protect public trust uses whenever feasible. The evidence that's been presented so far and the evidence that will be presented in written testimony, in the exhibits that have been submitted, and oral testimony at the hearing by all parties demonstrates that while MMR may have a right to divert up to 3 CFS of water from Stanshawk Creek, this right is not unconditional. The doctrine of reasonableness and public trust condition the MMR right to divert the water, and the evidence demonstrates that such action is required to ensure Stanshawk Creek and all its public trust resources will be protected to benefit the people of the state. Specific evidence presented by the Karuk tribe today, and maybe tomorrow, will demonstrate that there has been a harm to the public trust and tribal trust resources, and this evidence includes the following. Tribal uses of the Klamath River, which include cultural uses and fish consumption, are impaired by the lack of suitable habitat to sustain salmon resources on the Klamath River. The Klamath River is impaired due to excessively high temperatures. Floodplain thermal refugia, such as that provided by cold water flows from Stanshawk Creek, are essential to successful rearing of coho salmon, which is an endangered species. Tribal uses of the Klamath River, which include cultural uses and fish consumption. I already said that. Sorry. That's what you get for reading. Fish from throughout the mid-Klamath River use Stanshawk Creek. And by the mid-Klamath River, we're talking about from the confluence of the Trinity River to the base of Iron Gate Dam. The floodplain pool at Stanshawk Creek provides important year-round habitat for salmonids, including the coho salmon. The floodplain pool is naturally occurring. It does not depend on human intervention to serve its ecological function. And if anything, it is the diversions by Marble Mountain Ranch that have created the need for enhancement efforts to ensure that the very limited water available in the Stanshawk Creek today is maximized to assist with fish rearing and production. And finally, the tribe and others have attempted to meet with Marble Mountain Ranch to develop a collaborative physical solution to this problem. The evidence shows that wasn't able to be accomplished, and in fact, from our perspectives, action by the State Board is necessary to ensure that this occurs. As a final point, I'd like to note that the harm to the public trust resource is not, as MMR asserts in its briefing, insignificant. Marble Mountain Ranch asserts that Stanshawk Creek, including its floodplains, do not provide significant habitats for salmonids. The evidence does not support this assertion. They assert the floodplain pool is not naturally sustainable. Again, the evidence demonstrates this is false. And the evidence demonstrates that Marble Mountain Ranch diversions degrades and otherwise harms the public trust resources. So with that, I'd like to bring up Mr. Leaf-Hellman to testify. Thank you.
Good. Mr. Hellman, please approach. Thank you. We have a seat for you right here. Can you all see each other there? Yeah. So you can move over one. Yeah. We have a name tag for you there for the web. There we go. Thank you. Okay. All right, please proceed with the direct testimony of Leaf-Hellman. Thank you. So you are going to do direct testimony, so we're going to have you take the oath. Could you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth? And if so, answer yes, I do.
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Please be seated.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hellman. Can you please tell us your role with the Karuk tribe?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony today. My role with the Karuk tribe, I currently serve as the Director of Natural Resources and Environmental Policy for the Karuk tribe, a position that I've held more or less for the past 30 years. And in addition to that, I am an enrolled tribal member and a hereditary owner of the Sacred White Deerskin Dance, a trained world renewal priest and a ceremonial leader as well.
Can you describe for us quickly, you mentioned that you were a trained world renewal priest. What is the training for that involve?
The training as a world renewal priest, I began that training as a very young man and served as a practicing world renewal priest for over 19 years. That includes an annual 10-day actual period of fasting and going to the mountains alone, and similar to a vision questioning type situation where without food or water for several days on end, and communing with our relatives in the natural world.
So can you tell us how long have you lived in the Klamath Basin?
Yes, I was born in Orleans, where I currently reside today, and I've lived there my entire life.
And how long have you been familiar with Stanshaw Creek?
I guess most of my entire adult life. As soon as I was old enough to be aware of it. Stanshaw Creek is located near Soames Bar, and all of our river communities are small, tight-knit communities that have not a lot of. We have more trees than people, and so I'm very familiar with the area, and I would say intimately familiar with it.
Can you tell us the importance of the Klamath River to the Karuk culture?
Yes, we consider ourselves not only fix the world people, but we consider ourselves part of a reciprocal community that is dependent on one another for our survival, and we consider ourselves a salmon people, as salmon has been one of our primary subsistence foods for countless generations that in the place where we have our Aboriginal roots. So we say from time immemorial.
Can you give us a little bit more information about the importance of the salmon in particular to the Karuk's culture?
The salmon, not only do we have relied on in the past continue to rely on, to the extent that that salmon still persist in the basin, but we continue to rely on salmon for not only our subsistence use, but also in use in our ceremonies, as well as our basic identity is tied very closely to the salmon, and we consider salmon to be a very close relative of ours, and therefore are obliged to take care of them much as we are obliged to take care of our relations, human relations, as well as our non-human relations as well.
Is there any, or can you explain the importance of salmon to the health and the economy of the Karuk, and any changes that you've seen attributed to the availability of salmon?
Yes, and unfortunately, in my lifetime, I've seen a fairly precipitous decline in the salmon resources available in the Klamath Basin, and I'm well familiar with the direct impact that has on the health and the general health and well-being of Karuk people, and because of our close dependence on salmon. We've conducted a number of studies dating back to, I believe the first one was conducted about in 1995, that provides direct correlation between the lack of salmon in the diets of our tribal members today to the physical health and the prevalence of heart disease and many other diabetes and other related illnesses that are directly related to lack of salmon in the diet of contemporary Karuk people.
Okay, thanks for that overview and background. I'd like to turn specifically to Stanshaw Creek here, and ask you, are you familiar with the diversion from Stanshaw Creek to the Marble Mountain Ranch?
Yes, I am.
And what is your opinion of the impacts of the diversion on these uses of salmon and the Klamath River generally that you've described? What's the diversion of this impact to those uses?
I'm familiar with the diversion, the ditch diversion, and have, I think most recently toured that, I think maybe in 2016 or 15, with Doug Cole, in either 15 or 16. But so I am familiar with the diversions to the Marble Mountain Ranch, and I believe that the amount of diversion of water does have an impact on the stream habitat and the summer refugia that is provided by that by Stanshaw Creek, particularly at that area at the mouth of the stream and its confluence with the Klamath River, and I believe that those impacts, depending on the time of year, can be severe impacts, I believe.
And those impacts then translate into impacts on the tribe's uses of the fish in the river.
Sure. In my in my professional life or capacity as natural resources director, we have limited capacity to deal with issues, and certainly have to prioritize issues that we spend time and resources trying to address. But we've Stanshaw Creek, and it's is a unique system, and that thermal refugia that's provided at the mouth for juvenile coho, in particularly or specifically, is a unique attribute of that system, and because of that, we have and continue to invest resources in trying to take care of that place and monitoring that place because of its significance to the survival of juvenile cohos. It provides one of those unique habitats that is fairly restricted in the Klamath. There's not. There are a few places that we call these critical cold water refuges, and it certainly is one of them.
So you referenced that you had some meeting with Mr. Cole. Why did you go and meet with Doug Cole and Marble Mountain Ranch folks?
As I believe I've met with the Coles, I believe, at the public, the share or stakeholder meeting that was convened in Orleans, maybe in 2015. And subsequently met with Doug, and actually was gracious enough to tour his property, and as well as his diversion and his use of water, and so those are the only two occasions, I believe, that I've met with the Coles. But the reason for on those occasions is the same. We do view the Coles and Marble Mountain Ranch. They are part of our community. Our communities are small and close-knit communities, and while people don't always get along or share the same opinions about things, we all understand that we live in the same community, and we try to work things out on a local level and try to resolve conflicts. And certainly my meetings, any times I have met regarding this issue, is for that purpose, is to try to seek resolution to issues that that we believe are important to resolve, and we'll continue to work with folks to resolve issues as best that we can.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I have for now.
Thank you. And then at this point, I would like to offer opportunity for folks to cross-examine Mr. Hillman. First, the Division of Water Rights prosecution team. No questions from the prosecution team. And Marble Mountain Ranch. No questions. National Marine Fisheries Service. And Department of Fish and Wildlife. And Old Man River Trust. Klamath River Keeper. California Sports Fishing Protection Alliance. And PCFFA, who I don't think is here. Okay, and staff. Since there was, and obviously there will be no redirect testimony or recross, we're checking to see if staff may have any questions for you. We'll be right with you. All right, we're great. And Mr. Hillman, thank you so much for making the trip here to testify today as part of these proceedings. I appreciate your being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, with that, let's keep moving, and we will now continue Marble Mountain Ranch's remaining direct testimony. And then that would be followed by any cross-examination in the order I previously identified. Redirect and recross-examination of the witnesses may then be permitted after that point. And so we'll give you time to come up, Ms. Brenner, and we have a new witness.
Yes, this is Jeff Meyer.
Very good. Welcome. Okay, and so Mr. Meyer will be the witness. Are you going to call any other witnesses?
We'll be calling Douglas Cole after Mr. Meyer.
Very good.
We would like to do them individually, not as a panel.
That's fine. It's your choice.
I would also like to indicate that Mr. Myers is not testimony, direct testimony is fairly short. I'd like to reserve any of his extra time for Mr. Cole that has a lot more areas to cover.
Okay, that will be fine. I know you were standing up. Could you please stand up again? We're going to take the oath before your testimony. Do you swear to affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer yes, I do.
Yes, I do.
Thank you. You may be seated. Counsel, you may proceed.
Thanks. Can you go ahead and state your name for the record and your place of employment?
Yes, my name is Jeffrey K. Meyer. I go by Jeff. I work at eCorp Consulting, where I serve as the Director of Water Resources. And I've been at eCorp for almost 15 years and have 27 years of experience in this field.
Can you just explain what you mean by in this field, your qualifications?
My qualifications include hydrology development, operations modeling, water rights, water transfers. I can go on, but that, I think, embodies most of what I do.
Okay. And were you asked to take a look at the Marble Mountain Ranch diversion system and the data associated with that diversion and make any conclusions?
Yes, I was asked to analyze the water needs of Marble Mountain Ranch and did review mostly Joey Howard's data, but other data as well.
Okay, could you go ahead and summarize your testimony in that regard?
Yes. I started with Joey Howard's evaluation of the consumptive needs of Marble Mountain Ranch. I reviewed his methodology and confirmed that he used the state Title 23, Section 697 suggested demands for various uses. And when I reviewed his data, it was I believe it was the June 2016 analysis. I've since heard yesterday that he's updated that. I wasn't aware until yesterday that he updated that. After I reviewed his analysis, I interviewed Mr. Cole and wanted to update anything that Joey may have missed or that has been changed since his analysis. And so I had several exchanges with Mr. Cole, and I can summarize those if you're interested in the details. But Mr. Cole indicated to me that this effort was quite costly in that he was thinking about changing his business plan, which was an expansion of the services that he currently has there by opening up some RV spaces, some more tent campsites. It would require additional horses and livestock and just a general expansion of what he already provides. So I took all those things into account and I did my own analysis using the same method that Joey did, and came up with a slightly higher estimate of what the consumptive uses would, or consumptive needs would be for the ranch. Later to find out that Joey came up with the exact same number I did yesterday, which is about a quarter CFS at peak use in the summertime.
And that's just the consumptive use, correct?
Just the consumptive use.
Okay. Did you take a look at the hydropower use as well?
I did. I asked Mr. Cole to take a picture of the nameplate and send that to me on the generating unit so that I knew what the peak generation of that unit would be, and then it's 40 kilowatts. I then used some LiDAR data that was in the Fiore report to determine what the head is. I made an estimate of efficiency of the unit and came up with a flow that unit would need to generate at its peak efficiency, and I came up with about 2.8 CFS.
For the hydropower use?
At peak efficiency and peak generation.
Peak demand?
Yes.
Have you, are you familiar with open ditch systems in other parts of Northern California?
Yes, for about the past 20 years, it's really been my focus is to work for the Foothill and Sierra water districts. I'm a member of the Mountain Counties Water Resources Association, and my clients have made use of old mining ditches to serve as conveyance systems for their delivery. It's part of their delivery system at this point in time.
Can you just name some of those delivery systems that you've worked on?
Sure. Nevada Irrigation District, Placer County Water Agency, Georgetown Divide Public Utility District, El Dorado Irrigation District, Grizzly Flat Community Services District, Calaveras County Water District, Calaveras Public Utility District, Utica Water and Power Authority.
So your experience includes miles and miles of open ditch systems?
Hundreds of miles, yes.
And do you have experience with the amount of ditch loss that can be in the range of ditch loss that can be found in those various conveyance systems?
Yes, I've seen a wide variety of losses depending on how the ditches were constructed and in what soils types they were constructed. But it can range from a low of maybe about 15% to, I recently found a document that illustrates an 84% loss in a ditch.
That certainly, and is ditch loss of approximately 27% atypical for this type of open ditch system?
No, it's fairly typical, fairly common.
So, and you're familiar that that's what's been calculated at the Marble Mountain Ranch ditch system is approximately 27% ditch loss?
I did see an estimate, 0.4 of a CFS to 1 CFS. 1 CFS is about a 33% loss if you're diverting 3 CFS. 0.4 I think is about 15%. So yeah, it's reasonable, I think.
Pretty common.
Yeah.
In this type of open ditch operation, are you familiar with ditch failures?
Oh yes, yeah, that happens often, especially in very wet winters.
Can you just explain some of your experience with those ditch failures? Describe what we're talking about?
There can be, there's many different types that I'm aware of. Sometimes there are slides that fill the ditch and then cause the ditch to be overtopped. Trees can fall and damage the ditch, rock slides.
and occasionally they're just failures over time where the downstream side berm will fail and you know, spill water down the hillside.
I'm going to object to this testimony on the basis that it's not in Mr. Meyer's written testimony.
I believe it is.
Placer County Water District, that's in his written testimony.
Well, those are just examples of his experience.
I'll overrule the objection. It's relevant to your experience.
In your experience, what are the barriers to converting these types of open ditches to piped or lined ditches or covered somehow to prevent overtopping or failures?
They're expensive. There's usually a permitting process that has to happen, and when that does happen, oftentimes it's done a section at a time and spread out over long periods of time, mostly because these ditches are so long, and the effort to line them or pipe them is significant, especially on hillsides.
Steep hillsides like that found in Marble Mountain Ranch's ditch.
Yes,
It's difficult work.
it can be.
Did you do an estimate of, or your office prepare an estimate of the permitting cost associated with returning flow to Stanshaw Creek from
Yes.
the hydro flows?
Yes, yeah, we did prepare an estimate for all the environmental permits. We did not include a grading permit in that.
And what was that cost estimate?
We had a range of I think it was 196,000 to about 235, I believe, $235,000.
And what type of environmental documentation did that assume?
I have it here. I can pull that out if you give me a moment. There was some question whether we needed NEPA or not. We think we do because we're crossing Forest Service land. So that would include an initial study, mitigated neg deck, an NPDES permit, special use permit from the Forest Service for cultural surveys, cultural resource inventory report, AB 52 tribal consultation and Section 106 tribal consultation, a special use permit for construction from the Forest Service, and then some that were potentially required, we weren't sure yet. Biological assessment in support of Section 7 consultation process between the Forest Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Clean Water Act, Section 404 permit. State Water Resource Control Board 401 water quality certification. California Department of Fish and Wildlife 1602 streambed alteration agreement. State Water Pollution Prevention Plan and site inspections for construction.
So not all those permits are contained within that cost estimate, correct?
They are. They are.
And is that, but it does not include a full environmental impact report?
No, we thought we might be able to do an ISM&D, an initial study mitigated negative deck.
Do you know what the increased cost if you were needed to do a full EIR?
Significant?
Double,
Yes,
at least?
yes.
Is there anything else that you'd like to summarize from your testimony today?
The only thing we didn't talk about, and I don't know if it's pertinent here, but I spent some time talking to Mr. Cole about the fire camp and what's required during forest fires, where he provides a base camp for the firefighters, and as I understand it, the fire trucks that come and fill their tanks at the pond. He tells me that, and he can confirm this in his testimony, but he'll open the diversion ditch at 3 CFS to help fight fires, both to serve the firefighters and to support the firefighting effort.
So at
by filling
time-
trucks.
So at times, up to a full 3 CFS is used to fight fires as
Yeah.
well as consumptive use.
Right.
Anything else?
That's it.
Okay, I have nothing further.
Okay. At this time, is it okay, we could do cross? That way, we'll do this witness and then Mr. Cole. Okay, very good, thank you. So for cross-examination, first, the prosecution team for Division of Water Rights, welcome to come up and ask Mr. Meyer questions.
So just while we're getting set up, so at the end of yesterday, it was stated that we would have, for cross-examination, we would have an hour per witness or per panel. So do we have an hour to cross-examine Mr. Meyer?
Yeah, up to an hour.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Meyer, I wanted to ask you about your written testimony, starting on page 1. And you reference a statement number 16375, is that correct?
Yes,
Okay, but you don't reference a statement 15022, is that correct?
that's correct.
Okay, so you don't discuss that statement in your
No.
written testimony?
No.
Okay. And then asking about Mr. Howard's work. So Mr. Howard evaluated current uses at the ranch. Is that
As far as I know,
okay? And you generally agreed with his assessment of that.
I do.
Okay. And I think that was 0.18 without a fire crew, roughly, and about 0.235 with the fire crew.
Yeah, the document I had said 0.18 to, I think it's 0.20, or 0.22 possibly.
Okay,
Close enough.
fairly close.
Yeah.
All right. Do you recall his in reviewing his work? Did you review his general characterization of the point of diversion?
I did not.
Okay. Have you inspected the point of diversion?
I have not.
Okay. So you can't say that you're familiar with it in the sense that you've actually been out and done a personal and on-site inspection of the point of diversion.
That's correct.
Okay. Have you inspected the ditch system?
No,
Okay. So you haven't actually walked the ditch system?
I have not.
Okay. So does most of your information regarding the ditch system come from Mr. Cole and I believe also the LiDAR images that you referenced?
Yes.
Okay.
I've also seen some photos from some inspections.
Okay. And you can tell me if you don't have enough information for this. Mr. Howard characterized the point of diversion as diverting continuously throughout the year at the maximum rate possible and operating independent of demand. From what you've seen, would you generally agree with that?
That's not the way I understand it, but again, I have not been there. I've had discussions with Mr. Cole, and he tells me that he has limited diversions so that there is no discharge to Irving Creek and that he's only meeting consumptive use in the summer months.
Okay. And he modifies his diversion rate by, modifying the rocks and the outfall. Is in your understanding?
That's correct.
Okay. So he can't turn a knob
That's my
on a
understanding.
notice and change his diversion rate.
That's my understanding.
Okay. And, the current method of altering the diversion, would you say it's probably pretty time and labor intensive?
More so than others I've seen.
Okay.
I'm just going to object. It goes beyond the scope of his direct testimony.
Overruled.
Okay. And then I'd like to ask you about your approach number 2. This assessed potential future operations for the ranch. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So those are not uses that exist at present.
Correct.
Okay. And
Some are. I mean, it's an expansion of his current use.
but insofar as your assessment and approach to indicate some expansion or addition to use, that is a contemplated future use and not an existing use.
Correct.
Okay. And I think in your sources of information, I think you reference emails or conversations with Mr. Cole. I think you reference an email or two from Mr. Howard and Mr. Harling.
Correct.
Did you consult any additional information to assess those demands?
Other than what Joey Howard had done and the section 697 of the water code, no.
Okay. And for ditch loss, you estimated 0.4 to 1.0. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct.
Oh.
I actually got that from Joey's report,
Okay.
his estimate of the
Okay.
ditch
So that
loss.
was his estimate.
His estimate.
Okay. For that kind of range, would the lower end of that range generally correspond to a lower rate of diversion?
Yes.
So if they're diverting more water, then I'm not an engineer, so I'm probably going to grossly overgeneralize this question, but if there's a greater diversion rate, would you normally expect to see losses closer to the upper end of that estimate?
Yes.
Okay, so if they're only diverting for consumptive use demands, then you would expect to see losses towards the lower end of that estimate.
Yes.
And if they're diverting up to their full claim 3 CFS right, you would expect to see losses closer to the upper end of that estimate.
Correct.
Okay. And their consumptive use estimates were, 0.18 to 0.2, 0.25, roughly.
Correct.
Okay. So the 0.4 loss would apply even at those rates of diversion?
Well, 0.4 is more than 0.25, so that can't happen.
Okay. But it was an estimate.
Yes, I would maybe stick more to the percent of the loss rather
Okay.
than the absolute value of the loss
All right.
in that estimate.
Okay. I'd like to ask you next about your hydropower discussion. You mentioned that Mr. Cole sent you a photo of the Pelton wheel, and I believe you evaluated LiDAR photos, and did you use that information to determine the head characteristics like head and drop?
Yes, I actually had him send me a photo of the nameplate, which gives some information about what the generator can produce. And I used the LiDAR data in the Fiore report to estimate the change in elevation from the top of the penstock to the hydropower facility.
Did you personally inspect the hydropower system?
No, I didn't.
So you haven't actually inspected the Pelton wheel
No,
or the penstock?
no.
Okay. do you know whether the Marble Mountain actually measures its power generation?
I don't know.
Okay. Do you know whether they measure their power consumption?
I don't know.
Okay. And you said that the 40 kilowatts is essentially the maximum rating for the Pelton wheel itself?
For the generating unit.
For the generate, okay. But that isn't necessarily what they generate with that.
That would be the maximum.
Okay,
So if they have a lower electrical demand, then they can generate at a lower rate.
okay. So if their actual electrical demand is less than 40 kilowatts, then the Pelton wheel probably actually generates less than 40 kilowatts.
Yes.
Okay. Is that your equation that you use for generating kilowatts, is that generally a linear equation?
The equation's linear. The
Okay.
terms that are in the equation are not necessarily
All right. Okay.
linear.
But, you know, less flow would mean less power generated. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And for I think in your written testimony, you calculated 2.87 CFS necessary to generate 40 kilowatts.
That's
Is that
close.
correct? Okay.
Yeah.
To actually support that amount of flow, would the diversion have to divert for ditch loss in addition to that?
To achieve that, probably.
Okay. So it would be, let's say they want to generate 40 kilowatts and it's 2.8, and 40 kilowatts occurs at 2.87 CFS. They would need to divert 2.87 CFS plus whatever the ditch loss is going to be on that day.
Yeah, that's approximately correct.
Okay.
I wouldn't hold on to that number. I made an estimate of the efficiency of the unit. It's an older unit. The efficiency rates can vary. But yes,
Yeah.
in general, you have the right concept.
Are newer units usually more efficient?
Generally.
Okay. And you said that the generating capacity of the Pelton wheel is not necessarily their actual demand. Is that correct?
The peak generating capability of the Pelton wheel is not necessarily always there.
Again, forgive me,
Demand.
I'm a little outside the scope of outside my wheelhouse phrasing these questions.
It has the ability to generate at a range of flows and can produce less than 40 kilowatts.
Okay.
It doesn't always produce 40 kilowatts.
Do you know what the minimum of the range of flows is that it can generate
I don't know
useful
the
amount
exact
of power?
number. Their
Okay.
efficiencies drop off where it can no longer generate. And there's probably a minimum value that I would guess is 1.5 CFS. I'm
Okay.
guessing, but that's an educated guess.
So educated guess around maybe 1.5, you said? Okay.
Yeah, approximately.
Did you evaluate the flow capacity for the penstock?
I did not. I took a look at losses that could occur in the penstock, and it seemed I didn't do that analysis specifically, but what I did do is determine that losses are very low, so I would imagine it could pass up to 3 CFS and maybe more.
So you believe that are you testifying that you believe the flow capacity of the penstock is up to 3 CFS?
Sure.
Okay, so that's okay. But you haven't actually inspected the
No,
penstock?
I have not.
Okay.
I got some dimensions from Mr. Cole and used those in my calculations.
Okay. So I think Mr. Howard previously, in his report, he indicates that peak demand occurs in the summer in roughly hot mid-afternoon. Is that probably, would you generally agree with that?
Are we talking, well, my answer is yes. Are you talking about peak electrical demand or peak consumptive demand?
I apologize. Peak electrical demand.
I would agree with that because that's their peak season. They have the most guests there. I would imagine that that's probably a true statement.
Yeah. I think in one of our, well, I won't testify. But at other times of the year, the peak power demand would be lower.
The power demand would be lower in years where they are, or portions of the year where they're not, when they don't have as many guests. Yes, that makes sense to me.
Okay. So outside of their busy season, they would probably have lower power demands?
Yes.
Okay. And do you recall that Doug estimated has indicated his busy season is from April 1 to December 1?
I didn't ask him
Okay.
about when that was.
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised if
All
it's
right.
in there somewhere.
Do you know how many people are at the ranch roughly in the off season?
I believe I have some information about that. Right. I think he has 6 full-time residents in the off season.
Okay. So with 6 full-time residents in the off season, would you anticipate his peak power demands in the off season to be substantially lower than they are in the summer in his busy season?
Yes.
Okay. And to meet those peak power demands, would you say he needs less than, he would need to divert less than 3 CFS to generate the power necessary to meet those demands?
Probably.
Can you estimate how much less?
I don't know. I'm sure he has different types of needs in the wintertime where he's going to have heat, needs for heat that he doesn't have in the summertime. I don't know what his wintertime demands are. I just learned today that they get quite a bit of snow there, and I wasn't aware of that. So
Okay.
not sure.
All right. Have you looked at flow patterns in Stanshaw Creek?
No, I have not.
Okay. So you're not familiar with whether, say, flows are higher in the morning and lower in the afternoon or anything like that?
You're getting a diurnal
Yes.
discussion. You're asking me a question about
Yeah.
diurnal. I don't have any data to confirm that. My experience tells me, yes, I'm sure there is a diurnal fluctuation both in the winter and the summer. The more so in the spring runoff period where the snow is melting, daytime temperatures would increase the melt rate.
Okay.
Overnight temperatures would decrease the melt rate. In the summertime, you have evapotranspiration in the riparian corridor, and that's going to suck up in the hot periods of the day. It's going to suck up more water than it would in the overnight temperatures.
All right.
So you're going to see that. I'm sure of that, but I have no data
Okay.
to substantiate that.
So let's assuming that Stanshaw has a diurnal flow pattern. Is it possible that at times of the year flows could be, in the morning, flows could be sufficient to exceed the operating threshold of the Pelton wheel, and then later in the day, not sufficient to meet the operating threshold of the Pelton wheel?
At its peak, I mean, they're going to go up and down.
Yes.
So depending on what the flow is, I suppose that can happen.
Okay. And to match their diversion rate to their actual demand, they then need to go out and probably rearrange the rocks and other characteristics at the point of diversion?
I suppose.
Okay. And then I believe the last questions I have for you involve attachment A, where you estimate permitting costs. This is the only alternative you estimate permitting costs for, is that correct?
Yes, I had I guess it's part of a plan that was developed in 2004. It shows a 3,200 foot long pipeline to return flows from the hydro power unit to Stanshaw Creek.
Okay, but you didn't evaluate other alternatives?
This is the only one I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
And this estimate, it's only for permits. It does not estimate the cost of the project itself.
There's no construction costs in here, just permitting.
Okay, so it doesn't include materials, labor, anything like that?
Nope.
Okay. Okay. So those are all the questions we have.
Thank you, Mr. Petrozelli. Next, would the National Marine Fisheries Service be interested in asking any questions? No. Department of Fish and Wildlife? Kurok Tribe? Oh, well, you do have questions. Sorry, my apologies. Thank you. So, Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Just a quick question. What's the source of information in your testimony regarding fire protection, in particular on page 6 under the heading fire suppression, or fire protection, excuse me?
This information came from Mr. Cole.
So you didn't independently verify that?
I did not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Kurok Tribe, please. Mr. Hunt.
Hi, thanks. Another question about the fire prevention. In your testimony, you said that the pond is used for filling water for fire trucks. I was wondering if you knew whether there was a fire at or near the Marble Mountain Ranch this past summer.
I understood there were 2.
Okay, and do you know where the fire trucks filled their tanks during that fire?
My understanding is the pond.
What's your how do you have that understanding?
Mr. Cole.
You've never seen the fire crews take water from the pond?
I have not.
Okay. I was just curious, when you were testifying, you said that in response to a question about whether full EIR or EIS was required, that it would double the cost of obtaining the permits. Did you actually do a calculation?
That's just an estimate. I did not do a calculation.
Is it just speculation?
It is.
Early in your testimony, you were talking about various other open ditch conveyances that you'd evaluated, performed work related to. It's my understanding that that testimony is solely for the purposes of establishing his work experience and relevant expertise, but any testimony related to actual ditch conveyance losses in those situations is not factual evidence related to the reasonable use analysis in this case. Nonetheless, I'd still like to ask, how many of those systems that you were evaluating are obtain their water from streams that provide thermal refugia for endangered salmonids?
I'm going to say none of them.
Okay. And are there any of those ditch systems that are on streams that have and are used by Endangered Species Act listed salmon?
I don't believe so.
And are there any on streams that have current tribal uses that depend on salmon?
No, most of the work I do is above what we call rim reservoirs.
Okay. So it's probably fair to say that none of those streams have current designation under a basin plan as being thermal refugia for salmonids?
No, none of them would be.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Old Man River Trust. Mr. Fisher.
In your professional experience, are there alternative hydropower systems that could generate a given amount of electricity with less water?
I don't know. I don't design them, I evaluate them. There may be. I wouldn't be surprised if there are.
In your professional opinion, would it be possible to produce more power with a given amount of electricity with less water if one were to, say, use a more efficient system or have more head, i.e. more fall? Would that allow one to use less water for a given amount of electricity?
Yes.
Did you evaluate such systems, or were you asked to evaluate such systems?
I was not.
Okay. Are you familiar with them?
Systems that have
Systems
more
that
head?
use higher head, more efficient turbines,
I
thereby
know.
producing more with less.
I know of systems that have more head on them. I can't say that I have compared them to this particular one. I have not done that.
Okay. So, I mean, yeah. Thank you. Could you elaborate on the barriers you cited to piping water from Stanshaw Creek to the place of use?
I don't recall him testifying to that.
Barriers to piping water, you did not testify to that?
For the return flow?
In the context of, no, from the creek to the place of use. We were in the context of conveyance losses. I believe you indicated there were barriers to piping the water.
Yes, what's your question?
Could you elaborate on what the barriers are to piping the water rather than having a leaky ditch?
You want me to say them again? So you can gunite the ditches, you can pipe them, you can line them, and you're talking about barriers, so things that would...
Whatever you meant by barrier, I don't know if it was financial or physical or permitting.
So all of the above.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you built or advised people who are building gravity-fed systems that divert from a creek with a pipe?
Have I advised them to do
Are you
what?
familiar with, have you worked with systems that rely on diverting water from a creek using a pipe and gravity rather than a ditch?
Yes, I've seen that.
Okay, are you aware that that's the common practice in the area of Marble Mountain Ranch?
I'd object as to common practice. In what area?
Within 100 miles of Marble Mountain Ranch. It is, are you aware that that's the most common practice rather than open conveyance ditch?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Okay. In your experiences with conveyance ditches anywhere, have you evaluated ditches that are on this steep of a hillside?
Yes.
And Have you noticed that ditches on this steep of a hillside sometimes wash out, creating mudslides?
Yes.
And to the width of the ditch, are you familiar with ditches that are designed to convey roughly this amount of water that are as wide as Marble Mountain Ranch's ditch?
Yes.
Could you estimate if the water were to be piped, how big of a pipe it would be and how much it might cost?
No, that's a little bit
Okay.
out of my. I don't have the information to do all that.
Okay. So Mr. Cole did not ask you to evaluate alternatives that could accomplish the same goal with less water.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next, Klamath River Keeper. Any questions? I'm not sure if he's still here. Sea Spa, Mr. Schutz.
Good afternoon, Chris Schutz for the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance. Good afternoon, Mr. Meyer.
Good afternoon, Mr. Schutz.
I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the other projects that you've worked on, and you represented that they were similar in many respects to the facilities at Marble Mountain Ranch. Is that correct?
In that they are Gold Rush era ditches used to convey water, yes.
Right. So, in your experience, do the operators of these ditches have regular sort of not only maintenance but upgrade kinds of plans that they implement over the long term in order to avoid some of the problems you discussed?
Yes.
And as you indicated, I believe that they do this sort of on a chunk by chunk or area by area basis. Would that be a fair characterization?
Yes, that's correct.
If you were advising one of these operators regarding the long-term implementation of upgrades or just simply maintenance, how would you advise them to consider their planning in terms of relatively being proactive or being in reactive?
The object is vague and beyond the scope.
Yeah, I'd like you to rephrase the question. If you
Okay.
can.
If they have a relatively, if an operator has a relatively high ditch loss, do you think it's a prudent operation for them to implement long-term planning to reduce that loss?
Yes.
I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. And is PCFFA in the room? No? Okay. At this point, I'd like to provide council the opportunity to do any redirect testimony.
I have no redirect questions.
Thank you, Ms. Brenner. And how about staff? Any questions? No? All right. At this point, then, I believe you can call your next witness, Ms. Brenner. I think we should continue with the proceeding. So, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Meyer. And if you want to, do you want to take any time, or do you want to just continue along? Okay, a 5-minute break. Okay, we'll reconvene at 2:35. Okay, I think we're ready to go. As far as today's schedule goes, in the notice we did say we can go till 5 p.m. and that will be the plan for today. But if there's a logical break point before that, we'll all identify it. But at this point, we are available to conduct the hearing until 5 p.m. So with that, I'd like to ask counsel for Marble Mountain Ranch to call the next witness.
I'm calling Mr. Douglas Cole from Marble Mountain Ranch as the next witness.
Well, welcome, Mr. Cole. I could ask you to stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear to or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth? If so, answer yes, I do.
Yes, I do.
Thank you. You may be seated. Counsel?
Can I just ask Carrie to come up and assist? Yes. Thanks. So this is Carrie Fuller from my office.
Welcome. Make yourself comfortable.
Mr. Cole, can you please state your full name and where you reside?
Douglas Taylor Cole, 92520 State Highway 96, Soames Bar, California, 95568.
And do you own Marble Mountain Ranch with your wife?
I do.
And when did you purchase that ranch?
1994.
And who'd you purchase it from?
Bob and Judith Young.
Okay. Can you just give us a brief history of your ranch ownership? In other words, what did you walk into in 1994?
Bob and Judy Young operated then Young's Ranch Resort as an RV park and mobile home park, along with a fishing resort. It was licensed for 55 RV units and had several other mobile home sites as well, as in addition to roughly a dozen homes and cabins, which I have since remodeled and upgraded. That's the infrastructure. The business model was different than what we operate. Their business model was primarily as a RV park and recreational fishing camp.
And your business model?
Dude Ranch, we decided to fundamentally change the business model in order to reduce the footprint of the impact of a business in the community ecologically. So 55 RV hookups plus mobile homes plus the permanent residents plus the cabin rentals and campsites were operated so that there was a very large human population on the ranch with a much larger impact on water consumption, septic management, power demands, and other aesthetic issues that we wanted to eliminate. And our first decision in changing the business model was to move to a higher service, lower population-based business. And so we targeted a multi-use, multi-aspect dude ranch that was high service and lower in occupancy.
So how many cabins are at the ranch at this point?
We have 10 cabins, 3 rental homes, and numerous outbuildings and permanent residence for caretaking staff, employees, and other family and residents on the ranch.
And how many homes does it, so you listed how many cabins, how many homes are there?
That are occupied full-time?
Yes.
So there's my home, and there's my son's home with his wife. I have a caretaker and his family. So in the current configuration of our families, there are 6 individuals, likely to be more as children are born or elderly parents return home for care.
Okay. Can you indicate when you were first approached by the State Water Board or California Fish and Wildlife regarding, or the Regional Board regarding your diversions at Mmr Mountain Ranch?
Regarding the first the diversions, our first contact was about 4 years after we purchased the ranch in 1998.
And can you just briefly summarize what's been going on with the regulators since that time?
I first went into my relationships with the water board and all the regulators optimistically looking for win-win solutions, pragmatic answers to problems, and in an attempt to magnify my calling as a steward over the resources there at Marble Mountain Ranch. My first interaction with the water board was with Tony Wiedemann, actually prior to this, when he called me from the writing office and volunteered his assistance in establishing a potable water system, which was absent at the time. Over the years, my naivete has been unfortunately transformed into jaded pessimism as I've had interactions that have turned more into oppression and a deterrence to my efforts to improve the resource management at Marble Mountain Ranch.
Can you briefly describe to me, or describe the efforts to maintain and operate the diversion ditch at Marble Mountain Ranch since you took ownership?
Sure. The ditch as we inherited it from the Youngs was largely the same, from what I can tell, as what the gold miners left it 100 and some odd years ago. There was a wooden trestle right near the point of diversion, which carried water across an unnamed tertiary stream, which has been identified by Stormer as one of the points of his concern. This wooden trestle was leaky, subject to falling over, and exposed to impact from falling trees. It was a critical path that if it failed, it would immediately stop water flow to the ranch, and as our source of only domestic water and power at the time, it was critical to replace that. So one of our first moves was to upgrade the system to eliminate the leaky conveyance over this wooden flume. We also inherited a ditch that had a long period of time of gravel and sediment accumulation, so that the freeboard along good sections of the ditch was low, making it more susceptible to overtopping with pulses of water that might enter the ditch in a storm event. Threatening trees were leaning over the ditch, and threatening trees on the outberm were threatening to destroy the berm should they fall and have a root ball remove the outer berm. So basically, a large amount of inherited deferred maintenance was everywhere in the ranch, including on the ditch line.
And what efforts have you made to upgrade the maintenance and operations of that ditch system?
We didn't have the ability to tackle any one of the projects on the ranch in full renovation all at once. We didn't have the capital. It took all of our capital to just land on the ranch rather than to be able to show up and have millions of dollars to do this project, and that project. So we identified primary points of concern and prioritized them. As I mentioned, the first point of concern was the wooden trestle, which we replaced. The next point of concern over the years was to begin improving the berm and its stability. So we would take accumulated gravel placed there from the carrying capacity of Stanchow Creek and move it to the outer berm. We would take weaker sections of the ditch line as they would be identified and line them with half culverts, improving the chance of improving the conveyance and reducing ditch loss and improving the stability of the ditch. So this has been an ongoing 25-year project from the day we purchased the ranch and continues right now. If you look at images that are presented by the water board taken in 2014, you'll see dramatically different conditions now in 2017 because of ongoing maintenance. If you contrast the ditch in its appearance from the inspection visit in 2015, you would see that that was a much improved condition versus 2008. It's an ongoing and steady effort in order to make the conveyance capacity stabilized and protect it against natural forces, storms, and tree falls, whatever.
Did you also create some storage capacity at the Marble Mountain Ranch?
I did. The storage capacity has been based on a modular system that Tony Wiedemann helped me construct roughly about 1995, the first year or two after we were there. So we constructed water filtration systems based on slow sand and gravel, which are a gravity-driven system, and we had two 3,000-gallon water tanks that we could store water in, so that in the event we needed to shut off the ditch to maintain the ditch, we could do that and still have potable water. And also so that we could draw from a buffer rather than draw directly from the stream, and have some capacity to have stable supplies of water rather than being directly dependent on whether or not the ditch was flowing. There are periods of time when we need to shut the ditch off, and shutting off the ditch without that capacity meant we had no consumptive or domestic water at all. We've since then improved the capacity of our storage by adding a total of 7 tanks, and now that's part of our regular potable water treatment system, where we rotate from one tank to the next daily, so that we have a metered contact time for chlorine in our production of potable water.
Did you also replace the hydro generator system?
We did. The hydroelectric plant that we inherited was based on a Gold Rush era cast iron water wheel, rotating at 60 cycles per second, connected by a direct shaft to a generator, which was World War II era, producing direct current and modified to produce alternating current with an exciter motor, which was a modification from the earlier system, which produced DC current and ran the ranch based on old school knob and tube DC current. So there's been an evolution in the efficiency and quality of electricity over the years also. I replaced that system with a modern bronze water wheel, 18 inches in diameter, rotating at 1800 RPM, and driven by belts to a Lima brushless generator with the capacity of about 40 kilowatts when it's running at full head of water.
Are there times at the ranch where you actually, your energy demand actually exceeds the 40 kilowatts?
Yes, there are.
And can you describe those?
Those times happen primarily in the summer, when we have full guest capacity and the need to keep guests comfortable with air-conditioned cabins, with production in the kitchen for feeding, for running laundry facilities to handle housekeeping needs. In the winter, we can run the generator at full capacity with very little waste, because we have heating demands, but we have less occupancy on the ranch. So we run the generator at full capacity as long as we're permitted, based on available water and based on occupancy needs on the ranch.
So even in the winter, you need up to 40 kilowatts of power?
Absolutely. Even though we had less occupancy in the winter, the beneficial uses for heating draw the capacity to its limit.
It snows at Marble Mountain Ranch?
It does.
Are you able to adjust the power production of your generator system?
Of the hydroelectric plant?
Yes.
I am. By contrast with the replaced generator, which had one fixed jet, this system has 2 fixed jets that are available to be switched out with varying diameter jets, so that the flow can be adjusted to match the available flow of water to the hydro plant. So typically we would have a high flow setup and a low flow setup, and minor modifications between that. But in a nutshell, we would go to the largest jets in the winter when the most available water is available, and we could run the generator at full capacity to take advantage of the beneficial uses of heating the ranch and running all the other electrical needs on the ranch. as the season would progress into the spring and summer, we would switch down and truncate water use and use smaller jets. The generator runs more efficiently when you have a small jet with a full penstock than you do with a large jet and a partially filled penstock. So efficiency is improved by keeping the penstock full, and that's done by restricting the size of the jets as flow availability diminishes.
And you change those jets out to adjust for that
Correct.
condition.
Yeah.
How do you generate the additional electricity that's demanded at that time?
Historically, that's with diesel generators.
Have you considered solar energy?
I have.
And have you given some cost estimates?
I have.
What can you tell us what those are?
Hal Slater from his firm, which name I don't recall, gave me an estimate of approximating $500,000 to install a solar plant on the ranch, which would entail felling trees in a particular spot, installing solar panels, and bringing in a cargo container to fill with battery storages, and redistributing some power lines around the ranch. So that initial estimate was $500,000 approximately, and did not include ongoing maintenance issues or replacements of battery packs as they aged, or any other long-term maintenance.
Did Mr. Cole consider the fact that during the wintertime you have snow events?
Mr. Slater?
I mean, Mr. Slater,
Yeah.
sorry.
We had a discussion on that point. He seemed to think that there could be some benefit from a solar plant by when there was a sunny day, charging some batteries and running diesel during the periods of overcast. And so as a solar salesman, he was strong on promoting that it has beneficial use all the time. And hypothetically, I can see that the reality of the long periods of overcast and shorter daytimes was somewhat discouraging for me.
In this past month, have you experienced as many as a week with no sun?
That's a routine occurrence, including this past week.
So that's not an occurrence just in the dead of winter.
No.
Could you briefly describe your regular maintenance efforts at the ditch?
Sure. So the ditch can be observed indirectly by observing the outflow which comes down the ditch and seeing what's happening as the water goes through the hydro plant. So there's a direct observation that we can make there, as well as to how effectively the power plant is running when things are going smooth and there's no flickering in the light, no diminished power capacity, all things status quo. We have a general sense that things are okay on the ditch line because there's a direct relationship between what's happening on the ditch and what we see with power generation on the ranch. In addition, we do routine walks and inspection on the ditch, and those change in frequency based on the season. In the fall, when we have leaf fall, sometimes it requires walking the ditch and cleaning our so-called trash rack at the head of the penstock several times a day because of the amount of leaf litter which gets conveyed into the ditch, falls on the overhead canopy into the ditch, and then gets trapped onto the trash rack above our penstock. In the stable seasons, midsummer, it might be required, every other day, get an eye on it. If things look normal, check on the flows, see what's happening at the point of diversion. So the frequency of inspection on the ditch varies depending on the season of the year and the anticipated weather pattern. If we know that we've got a storm coming in that's going to drop 1.5 inches of rain in a day, we go up and shut down the ditch or reduce its flow. So it's based, our inspection and maintenance is based on seasonal changes as well as observations of the weather pattern.
Are there other maintenance efforts that you employ?
Yeah, we walk the ditch regularly to remove branches, leaf litter, obstacles that might have fallen into the ditch. We remove accumulated gravel and silts that are captured and entrained into the ditch from Stanshaw Creek. Stanchill Creek is a high sediment carrying capacity stream, and it acts as a natural gravel and sediment capturing tool. And so at the head of the ditch, you will see large cobble the sizes of grapefruits. As you move farther down the ditch, you'll see captured rock that is the size of a tangerine. Moving farther down the ditch, you'll see rock that's the size of a large marble to smaller gravel to sand to silt. All of this is entrained by the ditch from Stanchill Creek on a normal routine basis and increases in the spring when the carrying capacity of Stanchill Creek increases. And that's the material that we dig out from the ditch to recapture the freeboard of the berm and place on the top of the berm to strengthen it and use it as building material to support the ditch. So the idea that we can put water in a pipe and not worry about what's traveling down the pipe is a concern for me as I see the ditch managed and the historical things that we see in the running operation of the ditch, because we can't capture water from Stanchill Creek and run it 3/4 of a mile down to a penstock and into a water wheel without putting gravel into a water wheel. The ditch in its current operation acts as a natural sediment separation system so that we can end up with relatively clean water that impacts a water wheel and doesn't destroy it. In a matter of an hour, any water will be fully demolished by the impacts from gravel that would be entrained in a pipe directly at the head of Stanchill Creek.
Have these ongoing operation and maintenance efforts resulted in stabilizing the ditch system?
Yes, we haven't had an overtopping in 20 years, and the overtoppings we have seen in the early years were primarily at places where there was a low freeboard, legacy locations on the ditch that we inherited from our predecessor. I haven't got a single incident that I can say with confidence resulted in any gravel from an overtopping entering into the state of California waters.
And you indicated that Stanchill is sediment carrying system. What did you mean by that?
Stanchill Creek is a high gradient stream, as was testified to earlier, and it has the ability and the capacity to carry extremely large amounts of sediment. When I go out to maintain the ditch in the winter, I see on the opposite banks from our point of diversion and downstream regular slides from the steep gradients of the canyon that captures Stanchill Creek. When we walked the creek recently and in times past, we see regular locations where entire hillsides have sloughed off into Stanchill Creek, which is a concern for me as accusations are made that sediment in the refugial pool is sourced by my diversion. The capacity to produce gravel being captured by a refugial pool is far greater, hundreds of thousands of cubic yards greater than what the capacity of my ditch could conceive of producing. So just on normal observations in the canyon, if you're there in the winter, you see landslides as a natural event in the canyon. And those landslides happen every single year. They happen predominantly in larger storms, but larger storms happen in pulse events yearly. And sometimes I get, after a large storm, I have to shut my ditch off in the winter, dig it out in the top, and then reestablish the ditch so that we can return the ditch on. Not because anything happened in the ditch itself, but because Stanchill Creek planted gravel and sediments in the ditch in the course of one storm.
Okay. Did you participate in the stakeholders process for approximately 20 years?
I have. voluntarily. I've encouraged efforts to find proactive solutions to things that might happen in the ditch, such as possible overtoppings, proactive attempts to reduce our consumption on the ranch, and I can identify all the improvements we've done on the ranch if you'd like. I've proactively invited consultants and worked with them to try to find solutions originally to return all of our flows back to the anadromous stretch of Stanshaw Creek. We had a grant proposal prepared and submitted in 2004, and right when that was to be decided, apparently that grant was denied because Water Board could not acknowledge that we had a valid pre-1914 water right, and funders did not want to be drawn into threatened lawsuits by funding an improvement that Water Board didn't want to acknowledge was valid at that time, which led later on to an attempt to get a third-party independent law firm, Lenahan Law, to look at our water rights and determined that, in fact, we did have a valid water right. And so we began then with funding capacities to look at other issues such as alternative energy sources and pipings of the ditch, and that led to a later grant attempt to run a 6-inch pipe down the ditch and convey consumptive and domestic water without any of the ditch losses, and that grant was abandoned the day that it was to be funded, when we were told without any advance notice that should we accept this grant and do the piping, that we would be required to abandon our hydroelectric power water transmissions as well. I did not want to abandon our hydroelectric plant, and consulting with my family, we decided that acceptance of a 6-inch conveyance water line at the cost of losing our hydro plant water was not an acceptable option, and so that fell apart.
You mentioned briefly that you made improvements on the ranch for more efficiency. Can you just describe some of those?
Yes. When we purchased the ranch, Marble Mountain Ranch buildings were primarily buildings constructed 40 years prior to the purchase and earlier. So at that time, the Hayes family had built buildings to house Forest Service employees in the 1940s and 50s, and they had built cabins with very limited capital assets, and the buildings were uninsulated. They had single pane windows, doors without weather stripping, leaky water systems, poor conveyance of power to the buildings, and unsafe power in the buildings. So we began process targeting again the most exposed areas of the ranch in their risk to the public and in their exposure to misuse of the resource. We began stripping to the cabins to their frame, rewiring them, replumbing them, insulating them, installing new double pane windows, weather stripped doors, and making them so that they could be effectively heated, safely electrified, and more acceptable to the public that would be wanting to visit a modern dude ranch rather than live in a squalid fish camp. So we, building by building, proceeded on that process, doing the work ourselves as experienced carpenters and builders from our past employment and our own past businesses. We carried those skill sets with us, and so our winter program was we'd shut down the ranch and choose the worst buildings and upgrade them to make them more public friendly and more efficient. The ranch infrastructure for power dissemination and distribution was improved a piece at a time also. During the 150 years of occupancy on the ranch, no one person had a master plan of what was going to happen in the year 2017. So wire placements for power distribution were based on needs of the moment. And So as we bought the ranch in 1994, we inherited some very unbalanced power distributions, power lines that were unsafely placed inadequately in the ground with poor contacts. So there were ground faults, a lot of energy loss, both in transport because of distance, as well as in poor contacts and ground faults and inadequate wiring, so that it took more power to operate the ranch than was actually needed if you did a hypothetical analysis of what was actually being done on the ranch. Improvements can still be done on that point, and I acknowledge that, and I look forward to making those improvements as well.
So we've reached that time, and how much more time do you think you would need?
I think we would need about 5 more minutes.
I'll allow it.
Thank you. Did you also go in, did you, was the ranch prior to your purchase flood irrigated?
It was. The lower ditch line downstream of the hydroelectric plant would be blown open, and water flowed out, encouraged to flow out onto the pastures or gardens, or diverted and directed by secondary or tertiary ditch lines, so that the pastures, gardens, and facilities of the ranch were flood irrigated. We installed a tee off of the base of our hydro plant penstock to divert water in a pipe, 4-inch PVC pipe along the back end of the ranch, truncating to 3-inch ag line hook latch, so we can now take traditional agricultural pop-ups with hook latch aluminum lines and run sprinklers to gardens and pastures, and also we use that as a fire prevention base, so that we have adapters to use that same line for fire prevention.
Okay. I'm just going to kind of go out and briefly, since you mentioned fire, this last summer there was 2 fires within the area of Marble Mountain Ranch.
Right, there was the Marble Fire and the Hay Press Fire, part of a much larger complex, and both fires were right on the ranch. The Hay Press was not directly on ranch property, but was within a half to a quarter mile of the ranch. The Marble Fire was right on the ranch boundary. Our irrigation system was used by the firefighting crews to directly suppress the fires, as well as to fill fire engines, as well as to pump from the ditch, so that they could run sprinklers and run hose lines up the fire break to the top of the Bald Butte, as well as around the ranch. So the ditch infrastructure and agricultural infrastructure of the ranch was used as an integral part of the firefighting efforts in both the Marble Fire, the Hay Press Fire, and also used in previous fires over the 2 decades that 2+ decades that we've been there.
If you had placed any kind of plastic piping into the ditch system prior to this last summer's fire, would it still exist today?
It would have been burnt up. Other fires in the area that have had plastic pipe, they've lost their infrastructure because it's all been burnt up.
And did you, can we pull up, what exhibit number is it, Carrie?
For the fire?
Yeah.
It's MMR 10.
Can we take a look at MMR 10? Is that it?
Yeah. That's the beginning of it, I think.
Yeah, that's the start of the Marble Fire.
Can we go to the next slide, please? What's this depicting?
Yeah, these are hose lines on the ditch that the firefighting crews are, they installed pumps to directly intake water from the ditch line and pressurized the hose lines that they ran along stock trails, up fire break roads, and around the ranch perimeter, and then farther up to the top of the Bald Butte.
And that's a current depiction of how the ditch looks today.
That's how it looked as of July 2017.
Can we go to the next slide, please?
This is a pump directly taking water from the ditch to pressurize the fire hoses running up the fire break road at the Bald Butte Trail.
Can we go to the next slide, please? I want the winter slide. Can you stop there? This is evidence of the fire crew at the Marble Mountain Ranch.
Right. This is one of the hotshot crews moving up, staging and preparing to move up to the ditch line and farther along the stock trails to place fire hose.
And could you go to the next? And that's Marble Mountain 10, photograph number 6. Can you stop at 7, please? Is that a depiction of the devastation of the fire around Marble Mountain Ranch?
It is. I'd like to note the width of the berm. I'd like to note that the ditch is still flowing, that there are no overtoppings, and that in spite of the high intensity fire with burning debris falling into the ditch, that the ditch is operational and no sediment or waters from the ditch have departed from the ditch.
And that's Marble Mountain 10, photograph 7. So we wanted the winter.
Okay, are we getting close?
We're getting close. I thought there was a winter. Okay.
So an additional 5 minutes?
Additional 5 minutes, please.
Okay.
Thank you. And we won't need any more of those photos. Can I just take a quick minute?
Can I offer editorial on something on this while they're talking?
Is it a building on a previous point?
It is.
Okay.
Prior to the fire, this past winter we had a atypical heavy rain and snowfall event which pushed over thousands of trees onto the ditch, which is what then burnt on top of the ditch. So the ditch line in its current improved form survived not only 2 fires, but also a snow down event, which was historical.
Okay.
So let's go back to during the stakeholder process. Despite the issuance of the draft cleanup and abatement order, the stakeholder process continued, correct, in January of 2016?
Yes.
Was the NIMS flow recommendation still under discussion during that time?
To my understanding, yes.
Do you ever recall indicating during the stakeholder process that 1.5 CFS was adequate use for you at the ranch?
I do not.
Do you recall that you would indicate that 1.5 CFS would be adequate for just consumptive use?
Yes.
But that wouldn't have included hydropower
No.
use? Do you recall ever accepting or being able to, indicating to the stakeholder group that you would be able to operate under the NIMS bypass flow recommendations?
No.
Do you know how often, if you had to divert, if you were allowed to only divert 10% of the Stanchaw flow, how often you'd be able to divert up to the full 3 CFS?
Well, it would be seasonally doable, but not for much of the year. And so during wet months, if I could hypothetically take my full 3FS, there's plenty of water to do that. But the transition time changes on a wet year to a dry year. So if I had to have 10% of 2 CFS, 10% would be 0.2 CFS. There are years when Stanchaw is flowing at 1.5 CFS. So 10% of 1.5 leaving me 0.15 CFS is not really enough to do domestic flows or domestic and consumptive use.
Do you have a sense of, if in order to divert 3 CFS, Stanchaw would be at 30 CFS, correct?
Under that rule, which is pretty odd. I mean, it gets there in storm pulses, but that would mean I could only operate my hydro plant during the largest of storms. And under that scenario, I would be shutting it off under threat of loss of the ditch.
Correct. In high storm events, you shut it off.
I did. The quote, as I recall, was $7.50 to $8 per linear foot, which is well over $1 million to bring power to Marble Mountain Ranch from the nearest connecting point.
Were you ever provided any information on the cost to return the flow to Stanshaw?
Well, when we had that grant proposal, at the time, we were going to piggyback that with excavations done by the phone company to install fiber optic cable. And so all the environmental work had been done, the construction crews are on site. And as I recall, that grant was $260,000. I could be wrong, but that's the range that I'm remembering. If we had to do that now, it would be an entirely different story.
Do you have an estimate exceed $500,000?
No, millions.
Have you attempted to secure a discharge permit to allow you to use Irving Creek outfall?
I have.
Have you gotten any response from the
No
regulatory?
answer. We've had to run diesel for the last year and a half, 2 years, because there's been no response on that.
Do you know how much that has cost?
An additional $6,000 a month.
And have you proposed to operate your diversion to allow 2 CFS bypassed at the point of diversion?
I have.
And when there's less than 2 CFS, you'd reduce your diversion to 10% of the flow?
We've had that discussion, yes.
And this would allow you to continue to operate the hydro system and avoid the costs incurred recently in operating the diesel generator?
I'm not sure the question again.
I said this, if you were allowed to divert under a scenario that would bypass 2 CFS, and it was below 2 CFS, then just 10% of the flow, you could still operate oftentimes your hydroelectric
Yes, for example,
system.
right now Stanshaw Creek is flowing well over 5 CFS, so the 2 plus 3 is 5. And so, you know, I'm approximating we've got flows in Stanshaw of around 8 to 10 CFS right now, so there's plenty of water.
And I have just one more question. Have you also proposed piping or lining the diversion, at least the first portion of the diversion ditch?
I have.
I have nothing further.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks, Counselor. And at this point, the next stage is to offer cross-examination. And that, the first in line is the prosecution team. Are you prepared and ready to come up and cross-examine the witness? Yeah, since we had a brief break before, I propose we just continue in the name of efficiency. And the microphone is yours, Mr. Petrozelli.
Mr. Cole, you just indicated that flows in Stanshaw were currently well over 5 CFS. Have you measured that?
I haven't gone out and measured that, no.
Okay. So you haven't measured that flow?
I've observed it.
Okay. Are you trained in measuring flow through visual observation?
I have no formal training for measuring flows, only 25 years of managing the ditch.
Okay. So I'd like to move into asking you about your written testimony starting at the beginning.
Okay.
Paragraph 1, you indicate that the ranch currently hosts up to 45 guests at a time?
Correct.
Okay.
Oh,
And-
that's in the normal summer business model.
Okay.
Absent any other fire camp or other, occasionally we get charter groups that might be larger than that. That's the normal business model.
Okay. I think And Mr. Meyer, however, in his testimony states you plan to increase your capacity from 36 to 50. Do you recall that testimony?
I do.
Okay. So is your current guest capacity 36 guests or is it 45?
We have a guest capacity beds for 45. We tend to keep it around 36 out of preference for preferred group size, but we have a capacity that we advertise that can go up to like 50. That's our bed count versus what we prefer to operationally operate.
So your preferred limit is around 36?
Yes.
Okay. And in most of your statements of diversion in use, you indicate up to 50 people at the ranch during the busy season. Is that correct?
That's the normal status, yes.
Okay. So, just subtracting 36 from 50, or the remaining 14 people, usually family and staff?
Family and staff.
Okay. And in your written testimony, you state that you operate seasonally from April 1 to December 1. Is that correct?
Slight difference to that answer. We prefer to shut down soon after Thanksgiving, but we do occasionally do business through December. It just depends on the conditions of the river and whether or not we can continue operating our guided fly fishing business. So we can hypothetically stay in business as long as the river is fishable, as long as people can get there. But in a general sense, we operate sometimes earlier than April, like March, because spring break for a lot of people. If weather allows, we go earlier or later.
Okay, but typically, when you refer to your busy season,
Yes.
typically April 1 through December 1.
Right.
Okay, and that's 8 months. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And currently you claim a 3 CFS, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Have you ever indicated you could operate with less than that?
I've probably had discussions with people that we could operate with less than that, given changes in conveyance, other changes to our system. But under current situations, 3 CFS is what we need.
After the Linehan report came out, did you indicate you were willing to go forward with that, with the 1.16 CFS determination in that report to implement physical solutions?
I don't recall having said that. My bottom line has always been capturing sufficient water to allow us to sustain our business and our living there on the ranch. Whatever that is, that's the bottom line, and that's what I've agreed to. So we will, the point of discussion of 2 CFS, 2.5, 1.25, 1.75, if funding became available to magically create a hybrid solar system with improved hydroelectric plant and better conveyance, and we had a agreed maximum diversion of 1.75 CFS, and all of that preserved our energies to this point in our business and our life, yes. So the bottom line for me is, does it enable survival? And I don't recall that specific situation.
So if your business could continue operating with a lower peak diversion rate, you would be okay with that?
Survival of the business and our family's heritage, yes.
Okay. Do you recall the December 17, 2014 meeting with division staff and the subsequent stakeholder meeting?
I do.
Okay. Do you recall the site tour with staff in your pickup truck?
No, I don't deny that it happened, but I don't remember doing that.
So you don't recall conversations during the site visit?
Absolutely not. I couldn't recreate any conversations.
Okay, you wouldn't recall that at any point in conversations that might have occurred, you may have indicated that you were willing to accept the 1.16 number in the Linehan report?
I don't think I could recall a conversation with my own mother 3.5 years ago in a pickup truck, let alone state inspectors. The answer is no.
Okay. And you don't recall indicating to Will Harling that you were willing to go forward with that
I do
amount?
not.
You do not.
I do not.
Okay. Do you recall defending that determination at the stakeholder meeting to the effect asking people what was wrong with that number?
I'm sorry, I don't recall that either. I wish I did. I don't.
Okay. WR83. I'm going to continue asking you questions while she pulls that exhibit.
Sure.
Do you recall indicating during that meeting that you had to shut down your hydropower plant in June that year?
I don't recall that, but that's a real possibility that I said that. We often shut down our hydro plant based on water availability, and June would be a typical time when we would have the transition period between hydro generation and non-hydro generation. So that's quite possible that I said that.
And did you indicate that you spent about $4,000 on diesel fuel that month? Do you recall that?
Again, I don't recall that specific conversation, but I may have said that.
Okay.
Fuel bills or diesel fuel prices have changed and evolved over, especially recently. So that number may have been appropriate at the time.
Yeah, Mr. Cole, I'd like to direct your attention to this exhibit. This exhibit was notes from that meeting presented from Mr. Harling. It indicates that there were multiple attendees at that meeting, including water board staff.
Right. My name is spelled wrong on that, I just noticed.
There
Go
are
ahead.
several misspellings in these notes. And I'd like to direct your attention to this conversation surrounding the highlighted portion, where there's a discussion about the amount in the report. And you seem to be asserting that your right is 3 CFS, but in finding a number that people are comfortable with, you indicate what's wrong with the number in the report.
Okay, which
Does this
number are we
refresh your
talking
memory
about?
at all?
I need to be directed to which number in the report we're talking about.
You're indicating what's wrong with the number in the report.
Are we talking the conveyance loss, the total water right amount, the consumptive uses, or what? I don't know which number we're talking about at this point.
Well, the conversation about the report at this point in the meeting relates to the conclusion in the report of the Marble Mountain water right.
Okay, so I'm looking a couple of comments above from Barbara, where Barbara states, we're still of the opinion this is a 3 CFS water right. The question is, can we agree to some kind of physical solution? Taro responds, I don't think we can get to a final stage without us giving an opinion, being the water board. What do NFWF and NOAA need to fund a solution? From Conrad, Bob, we need a number to move forward with the solution. I'm presuming we're talking about the 3 CFS, which was just sentences before that. We don't want to revisit this in 10 or 15 years. So my reading of this is that I'm responding to the sentence, the comment from Barbara 4 sentences prior.
Do you recall the conclusion of regarding the Marble Mountain Ranch water right in that report? Was it 3 CFS or was it 1.16?
The number that I'm recalling was that ultimately the water board's assessment was that we would ultimately prevail in preserving a 3 CFS water right.
Was that the assessment from the division?
I don't recall.
Okay, so you don't recall whether that was the assessment from the division or the assessment from the Linehan report?
I'm thinking that was, you've got the documents. I'm trying to pull my memory out. I can't do that at this
I'm
point.
just
so.
trying to get some clarity as to what you meant by this statement.
Well, based on the conversation that I'm reading here, the conversation was about water rights of a capacity at 3 CFS. And my question, what's wrong with this number, would relate to the most recent sentence on the topic of flow, which is 3 CFS. So that's how I'm reading that.
So your recollection was that the Linehan report concluded your right was 3 CFS?
Yeah, I don't recall.
Okay, so you don't
Yeah.
recall what this number was?
No, my response here, right now, my read on what this conversation is about is the 3 CFS water right number at this point. Unfortunately, I wish I did have a 100% recall for 3 years back. I don't, Mr. Petrozelli, so I'm trying to regenerate that memory by reading this, and that's what I come up with.
Yeah, I had hoped to possibly refresh your recollection.
Okay.
Okay. Let's go back to.
And just for the record, the exhibit number that we were just referring to is WR 83.
Do you know what exhibit number that was?
The one that we were just on?
I'll advise council we can hear you whispering.
I'm sorry. It was 83. So let's go to page 3 of your written testimony. Is it your assertion that since about May 2015, have you limited your diversion to consumptive demands?
That's correct.
Okay. And that meant not diverting for hydropower. Would that be correct?
That's correct, with the caveat that I diverted more during fire prevention.
Okay. Does your Pelton wheel have a minimum operating threshold?
I'm certain that it does. What it is, I don't know. I can only tell you that we change the jet sizes to match the available water and go to smaller jets as we have less available water. And what the minimum amount of flow required to operate that hydro plant is, I don't know. We, for pragmatic purposes, would often shut it off at a certain point just because it would become, for the sake of ease of operation of our business, easier just to run the diesel when it got to a certain point. So we would shut down the hydro plant and run the diesel.
Do you recall Mr. Howard's testimony yesterday when he indicated that he went on an occasion when he was visiting the ranch, he saw water flowing through the Pelton wheel, not generating power?
I do.
Okay. Would you tend to agree with that incident, with that testimony?
What hasn't been identified is the fact that there are more hydroelectric plants using that water than Marble Mountain Ranch, and especially at that time that he was observing. The Blue Heron Ranch had a permitted water diversion and hydroelectric generation permit and used our effluent to operate their system. But official uses of that water for hydroplant generation include ours as well as the Blue Heron Ranch, which is down ditch.
And you used the past tense for that.
Well, they haven't operated it since we haven't been able to operate our power plant. So when we go to strictly consumptive use, they've been denied the operation of their hydro plant as well. When Joey Howard was there and observed that there was water going through the hydroelectric plant when we were not operating it, that did two things. That refreshed our pond for beneficial use, that allowed for stock watering along access points to our pasture, and it powered the hydroelectric plant at the Blue Heron.
So in your experience, would you say that Stanshaw Creek has a diurnal flow pattern, higher in the morning, lower later in the day?
Most definitely.
Okay. And at times of year, would you say that in the morning the flows are high enough to operate the Pelton wheel, and then not high enough later in the day?
You can hypothetically get to a point where as the water availability drops and you have a cyclical diurnal availability of flows, that you could be at the peak of the diurnal graph and be within the range of the hydro plant, and at the bottom be outside the reach of the hydroelectric plant. That's a transition time where we would typically just shut down the hydroelectric plant.
And would you switch over to diesel at that
Correct.
point? Okay. Would you be able to go out to the point of diversion and lower your diversion rate or modify your diversion rate to meet whatever your actual demands would then be at that time?
Yes, and that's fairly easily done.
So on a summer afternoon, you can go out to the point of diversion, rearrange the rocks.
No.
Okay, but you just said it was easily done.
Yes.
Okay.
There are 2 weirs that I installed as part of the improvement processes on the ditch. The management of the ditch requires a couple of points in the upper headwaters of the ditch to allow venting of excess flows. And as storm pulses come through, sometimes quite rapidly in the middle of the night, there has to be a way for a pulse of water to bleed out of the ditch without somebody being there to shut down a valve. That need is accommodated by weirs, which have a preset freeboard and adjustable boards on them, so that as we go in and out of storm pulses, we can raise and lower those. In the hypothetical scenario where we have a ditch capture of 13 Stanshaw units, which is an arbitrary number we use with like hash marks along the side of one of our culverts. And in this hypothetical scenario, if we have a storm pulse coming in of a couple inches of water, we would drop down the weir, anticipating that we would want to have increased venting capacity so that less water would travel down the ditch in a pulse as we approached into a storm. If we sensed that there was a major storm coming, we would go off and fully open those weirs, venting all of the captured water back into the Stanshaw Creek drainage, and sometimes even blowing out the rock and rubble berm itself by moving larger boulders.
So are you actually able to modify your diversion rate on a daily basis?
You are, by moving up the ditch and taking a 1/2-inch thick board off, putting a 1/2-inch thick board on, putting a piece of plywood on, off, putting a 2-inch board on, off.
Can you precisely match that diversion to fairly precisely match that diversion to your to what your demands would be at that time?
It works.
So you can.
It's manageable. Yes, it works.
Okay. And you can do that daily.
I can do that daily. I can do that several times during a day if I needed to, but the usual routine is that we see longer weather patterns and longer term needs, and so we don't have a reason to go up and in 1 hour put a board in, take a board out, and then 2 hours later put a board in, put a board out. We have weather patterns and longer range needs, which means that we end up doing that on a less frequent basis, although we hypothetically could make micro adjustments on a moment by moment basis.
So
the need just doesn't happen.
Okay. So do you recall the technical report authored by Mr. Howard?
I do.
And do you recall that in that report he states that your diversion rate, that the amount you divert is independent of what your actual demands are?
Yes, and I'm not sure what he means by that.
So you seem to recall, you generally recall that statement, but you don't fully
You've refreshed my
understand it.
memory that he said that, but I don't know what he means by that, because that's not the case.
Ms. Mapes is going to pull that up, and I'll
Sure.
continue asking you questions while she does that.
Joey may have made assumptions on assumption on operation or an incomplete understanding. The reality is that within a realm, we can accurately match diversion to what the need is. And that's evidenced by the fact that we haven't had any overtoppings in 20 years. It's evidenced by the fact that we can capture just enough water to remain on the ranch and not go off of the outfall to Irving Creek and exercise our right for consumptive and domestic uses without running the hydroelectric plant. So we can capture just enough so that we can beneficially consume and use that amount.
So if you had, say, a daily flow requirement, you could go out and change the boards to meet a daily flow requirement.
Within reason, yes.
But you would have the ability to go out daily to modify your diversion rate to meet what the required flow rate would be.
Presuming, the problem that I have is if there's a number that says you may capture 2.9 CFS and no more. 2.9 is a number which is fixed, and it places me at risk of a violation if I capture 3.1 CFS. The ability to manage is within the realms of reality for what the ditch is in our circumstance. It's not within the realms of reality for managing at a fixed arbitrary number. And that's one of the problems I have, is that if I don't want to agree to a solution which is going to place me in violation of because I'm meeting the spirit of a law but not a letter of a law.
I don't want to get hung up on, a particular bypass number or not right now. I just want to get an idea of what your ability might be to meet a certain number, assuming that number is, your ability to modify your diversion to meet a certain number.
Okay.
So are you saying that you can't modify, you can't regulate your diversion to divert a specific amount of water, or were you recently saying that it's just not precise to 1/10 of a CFS or to 2/10 of a CFS?
Yes. All of the above on one interpretation. Here's, if I can take a minute to, without having seen and operated the ditch, you don't have the understanding of the subtle nuances of what it takes to manage the diversion. So if I may take a moment, I can explain some of this.
Well, let me ask you about, I'd like to ask you about Mr. Howard's report.
Okay.
This is, I think, page 6 of that report here, section 5.1, where he discusses the water distribution system, which he testified, his knowledge of which was based on conversations with you and inspections. He states, the amount diverted typically varies with available stream flow independent of demand.
Marble Mountain Ranch is a closed system. Electrically.
I didn't ask you a question yet.
Yes. Okay.
Would you agree with that statement?
No.
So Mr. Howard's a professional engineer. He inspected the facility. He talked to you, and you don't agree with that statement.
The amount diverted typically varies.
If you don't understand it, just say you don't understand it. But, do you agree with it?
I don't think I do.
Okay. Are you a trained engineer?
Only on the ground with pragmatic experience, not because I've got a degree. I have in engineering, I have basic science degrees, but not an engineering degree. I've managed the ditch for 25 years and the associated components of it. So you're right, I'm not an engineer.
I wanted to ask you about your statement about ditch overtoppings. Are you familiar with the Stanshaw Creek Coho Enhancement Project?
No.
Do you recall a restoration project in the thermal refugia pool that was
I'm aware
completed?
of it.
Okay, do you recall that project was completed roughly around 2013, 2014?
Oh, well, I don't recall that, but I accept that you're telling me that.
Okay. to the extent you're aware of that project, was that project necessitated in part due to ditch failures at Marble Mountain Ranch?
I would say definitely no. I'm not aware of any ditch failure contributing at any point to any event at the refusal pool at Stanshaw.
I would like, can you read this sentence, please?
Can you please describe the
Can
exhibit
you read
number?
this
and what
highlighted
you're-
sentence, please?
Could you explain where the sentence is coming from?
Okay, this sentence is coming from the report for the Coho Habitat Enhancement Project. This is an attachment to notice of violation number 3 from the regional board.
I just need an exhibit number.
It is exhibit number 167.
Thank you.
Mr. Cole, can you read that highlighted sentence?
One moment, please. I'm trying to get the context.
I'm going to highlight a little more.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, approximately 560 cubic yards of gravel and rock were removed from the head of an existing pool, restoring and enhancing the pre-2006 form and function of this heavily utilized off-channel rearing habitat. Originating from Stanshaw Creek, the bulk of the sediment plug was deposited during the 2005/2006 flood event when the upstream ditch diversion to Marble Mountain Ranch overtopped, causing severe gully erosion. That's what it says.
Okay, thank you. So, going back to a discussion about your energy demands, I believe the report from Mr. Howard and described your peak energy demands as occurring during the summer. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I would.
Okay. And that's when you have roughly 50 people at the ranch?
Under
usually?
normal circumstances.
Under normal
Correct.
circumstances, okay. Under the expansion scenario you discussed with Mr. Meyer that he outlines in his testimony, would you anticipate having higher power demands?
You cannot have more people in presence without having some higher power demand. The purpose of an increased occupancy on the ranch is to fund the improvements and the defenses of the water rights. So it's kind of an ironic scenario we're talking about, but yeah.
So you would probably need more power to support
Correct.
the greater number of people. Okay. And since they're highest in the summer, I think you even characterized your peak use in the summer as in the hot afternoons when people come back from rafting on the river.
That's typically the case.
Yeah. You have a colorful personality, so statements tend to stick.
I'm sorry if that offends you.
Not in the least. But outside of your typical busy season, would you characterize your power needs as lower than in the summer?
Outside of the busy season would,
So in the off season,
yes.
are your power needs lower than they are in the summer?
Yes.
Okay. And that's when you have 50 people at the ranch? Or the
well,
peak season is when you have 50 people?
I need to clarify that answer. We use every bit of power generation from the hydroelectric plant that's available in the winter, which is roughly 40 kW. And the reason is that even though we have less occupancy in the winter, all of that hydroelectric power generation is used for heating buildings. So the hypothetical scenario where there's the least demand for power would happen when there was no need to condition living circumstances by heating or cooling, and there was no occupation or low occupation on the ranch. In the winter, when it's the least occupied ranch scenario, we have substantial power demands, and those were historically met by the low impact use of a hydroelectric plant. Now, under the last year and a half, 2 years, we've had to run the diesel 24/7, 365 in order to heat and take care of the small population on the ranch, which is part of my complaint right now, is that I don't have the funds and the capacity to continue making improvements when I have to spend money on diesel fuel bills that could otherwise go to beneficial use improvements.
So, and when you say the small number of people at the ranch in the off season, is that about 6 people?
That's the way it is. That's what it is right now.
Okay.
It will not be that in the near future when my in-laws come home to finish out their life, and when my son and his wife have children, and when I bring in the next caretaker. So the scenario right now is 6 individuals permanently living on the ranch. It will soon be somewhat larger than that.
So you use all of the power that you generate, but does your hydropower system include a heat sink to dispense heat produced by excess generation?
It does, and thank you for asking. I'd like to
And is
elaborate
this-
on that.
Is this a photograph of that system?
This is the current hydroelectric plant, and can I explain what a closed system is? I mentioned that earlier.
Okay, and just so people understand, is a stream of water here, is that hot water produced by the heat sink system?
It is heated water.
Okay.
So in a closed system, you have to consume every bit of power that is generated, or it burns up appliances and burns down buildings. So to that end, this system has a series of relay switches which turn on heat sinks, some of which are beneficial uses, such as a heat sink which turns on a baseboard heater or some other appliance, a pool pump, some beneficial use as immediate demands diminish. Somebody turns on a microwave, the peak demand goes up momentarily, the microwave shuts off, and suddenly there's more available power being generated by a hydroelectric plant with a fixed flow coming through it than can be used. So this computer system and hydroelectric plant that you just showed the picture of has a system to divert excess power as momentary fluctuations happen, including beneficial heat dumps, and as a last resort, a series of water heater elements which act as an energy sink so that the ranch doesn't burn down.
Where does the water discharged by that heat sink system go?
That would go out into my pond.
Okay.
And just for the record, that was Exhibit WR82, Figure 4.
Thank you.
That's a
apologize
garden
for-
hose. That's a garden hose stream.
Okay.
And the amount of heat put into it varies depending on the moment. And sometimes it won't be on at all because we're in full consumption of the power. If we have more available power and the beneficial heat sinks aren't needed, then it might be used more.
Do you measure your power consumption?
There's no way to measure the power consumption unless you put a amp meter on the lines and take a direct reading. But
But
there's
you
no,
don't measure, so you don't measure.
I don't have to have a meter. There's
Just
nobody.
asking whether you
Yeah, I
measure.
don't.
Okay. Do you measure your power generation?
Nobody asked me how many kilowatts I'm burning on any given moment, so the answer is no.
Okay. Do you recognize this LiDAR image?
I do. It looks like the image from the Rocco Fiore report.
So this is Marble Mountain Ranch Exhibit 12. It is page 4, and it is figure 1, trying to remember to accommodate the hearing team. Do you recognize the straight line here?
That's the penstock from the upper end of the ditch leading down to the power plant at the bottom of the penstock.
And are these erosion points? that Mr. Fiore has identified along the length of the penstock?
They are not. That's part of the Bald Butte Trail system, which originates on the ranch and then departs from the ranch up to the back of
So
Bald
these
Butte. That's-
numbers here are not erosion points.
No. I'm going to call those elevation points from what I can tell from here. I don't know for sure. It's hard for me to read.
And this is not an erosion point.
That is a legacy erosion point.
Okay.
At the top of the vertical blue line is the entrance to the penstock. Excess water that doesn't get captured into the penstock has historically flowed down that line where your cursor is going and then re-entered the lower ditch line, which then runs out to our pond.
So just to have it clear for the record, you're describing the darker line by the penstock on the LiDAR image, is that correct?
Yeah, that's Marble Mountain Ranch property. That's the legacy excess water from what would be captured directly into the penstock would flow down there over the last 150 years and has created that line of erosion.
Okay, thank you. So let's go back to your written testimony.
Okay.
And in your testimony, do you state that you recently replaced the storage tanks at the ranch?
That's correct.
And that's now with 7 3,000-gallon tanks?
You know, I may be off on the gallon capacity of the tanks, but it is 7 tanks.
And is it correct, would you say that this could support the ranch for a week at its full capacity?
That would depend on what's happening on the ranch. That wouldn't allow irrigation of pastures. That wouldn't allow any sort of dust control. That wouldn't allow any fire prevention. A week, and also that would be based on some rejuvenation of the tanks. If I shut off the ditch and went to a minimalist consumption protocol where only people flushed toilets and drank water and there was no watering of gardens, then that would be sufficient for a week.
Do you recognize this exhibit? This is exhibit WR 157.
I don't know what this is.
Do you recognize this portion of the exhibit?
No, but if you'd like me to take a moment and read it, I'm happy to do that.
Okay. Does this look familiar?
Could you identify what you're
Okay,
looking
this
at?
is a letter submitted
No,
by...
an exhibit number.
This is exhibit WR 157, as previously stated. This is a letter from your attorney responding to an information request by enforcement. Were answers to these questions provided by you or by your attorney?
I would have to read them in order to answer that question.
So I'd like to direct your attention to number 19, the discussion about requesting invoices for the cost of repairing the water tanks.
Okay.
And in that paragraph, do you disclose the cost of the new tanks?
Yes, it appears that I do.
Okay.
But I might add that the addition of additional storage tanks may or may not have been included in that. I did a sequential evolution of improving the capacity of the water purification system. So, and I don't recall where that
Okay.
is on that timeline.
And as this discussion continues to the next page, I'm going to highlight this portion. Okay, I'll highlight. Okay. So if you can just try to read the highlighted portion here, excluding the footer and page number.
You want me to read just the part that's highlighted?
Yes, please.
Additional water storage tanks purchased by, and I presume you don't want the numbers on the bottom of the page read. Marble Mountain Ranch separately, approximately $1,700 per tank to bring to a total of 7 2,600 gallons, so I guess they were not 3,000, they're 2,600 gallon Snyder storage tanks with parentheses, 1 week storage capacity at full ranch occupancy.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll go back to your written testimony.
Right?
I believe page 4, paragraph 1. And here you describe how water discharges from the hydro plant and then pond eventually discharged to Irving Creek. So in that regard, by discharging to Irving Creek, it does not return flow back to Stanshaw Creek. Would that be correct?
That's correct. Irving
Okay.
Creek is neighboring drainage and they're not directly connected.
Okay. And then continuing to page 7. You discuss the cleanup and abatement order and the history of the water board's actions. Did you file a petition for state board review of the cleanup and abatement order?
I can't answer that. I'd have to consult with my attorney.
Okay. Did you challenge that order in court at all?
This is my first court appearance.
Okay. So going on to page, but here, in your written testimony, we'll come back to this. Okay. So we'll come back to this. Oh. So this regards the cleanup and abatement order. Can you read this highlighted sentence, please?
In response to the CAO on September 6th, 2016, we filed a petition for review and stay of cleanup and abatement order number R1-2016-0031, parentheses, the quotes petition, end quotes, to the State Water Board.
Are you aware of whether that petition for review was granted by the State Water Board?
I can't answer that. I've left the legal parameters and issues up to my attorney team.
Okay, fair enough. I'd like to go on to page 9. And in this portion of your testimony, you discuss voluntarily foregoing your hydropower diversion and limiting your diversion to consumptive use.
Okay.
Okay, and is this a voluntary election to limit your diversion?
I've recently voluntarily eliminated hydropower generation entirely during the summer so that we can maximize flows back to Stanshaw Creek. Historically, we would have gone through this gradual truncation of our hydropower generation as available flows were there, and we would reduce the jet size to maximize penstock pressure and still maintain power generation via the hydroelectric plant. and mix it in combination with the diesel power generation plant. My effort to be a contributor to the process is manifest here by the fact that we have voluntarily shut down that and limited our flows to consumptive and domestic flows during the summer months of June, July, and August.
Okay, and this is voluntary?
Voluntary.
Okay. And have you indicated an intent to resume diversions up to your 3 CFS claim once the stakeholder issues are, in your mind, resolved?
I need to divert 3 CFS and generate hydropower through the winter when it is not an impact to the waters of state of California. And so, yes, seasonally through the course of a year, I don't intend to try to reestablish hydroplant generation when it is an impact to the fishery. That is my decision. That is a good show effort of faith and an effort to try to be a contributor and a player in the community and a steward of the resource. So I'm shutting off hydroelectric generation during the summer and voluntarily doing diesel power plant generation, which unfortunately has a large carbon footprint and brings up another whole set of issues, but that's what I have available. If fish is the priority at Stanshaw and not other environmental issues, then so be it. I will generate power via diesel during those 3 months and voluntarily turn off my hydroelectric plant. I need to turn the hydroelectric plant back on in the winter when I can heat our buildings and not have an impact on the fishery.
So when you have to operate your, have you previously indicated that operating your diesel generator through the summer costs you roughly around $4,000 for a month?
That might have been the case then. That's not the case now.
Have you indicated that in we'll come back to that.
Mr. Petrozelli, the essence of my position is that I will burn diesel in the summer if I can run, hoping that I can run hydroelectric when the flows are greater. There is no impact or damage to the fishery by diverting water from Stanshaw when Stanshaw has excess flows, and I can beneficially use those flows. That's my position.
Okay. This is Marble Mountain Ranch, Exhibit 16. It's page 28. Can you identify what this is?
It appears to be 2013 Schedule C tax return, profit and loss for business.
Okay. And is it large enough for you to read what's in box 7?
It's not for me.
Okay.
I can't tell what that is other than the general concept of what's happening here.
It's a little small for me too. Is this better?
Okay.
In box 7, is that your reported gross income?
It is.
And is that amount $437,000? $437 and $333?
It is.
Okay. And then in box 13, do you report a depreciation amount of $40,120?
I do.
And in box 17 for legal and professional services, did you report $18,545?
Yes.
And then going down to box 21, did you report $22,972?
Yes.
And that's for repairs and maintenance?
Yes.
Okay. And then going down to box 25, for utilities, you reported $31,296. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Does that include the cost for running your diesel generator?
In all likelihood, yes, although I
Okay.
can't recall the inclusions in that category. I would presume that it does.
Okay. And then in box 31, did you report a profit of approximately $53,000?
I did.
Okay. And then I'm going to go down to page 29 of the PDF. And under Part 5, where it reports other expenses, you list $145,000 roughly. Is that correct?
Yes.
It says see statement. Have you included that statement in this exhibit?
I have no idea.
So you couldn't identify it here.
No.
Okay. And then going to page 25. Is this your 2014 Schedule C?
It is.
Okay. For this year, did you report, for 2014, did you report a gross income of almost $475,000?
Yes.
And would that have been an increase from 2013?
I already can't remember what 2013 was. You'll have to refresh my memory, please.
I believe you reported your gross income as roughly $437,000 for 2013.
That would, yes, then of course be an increase.
So that would be an increase. Okay. So you made more money in 2014 than you did in 2013.
I grossed more money in 2014
Okay.
than I did in 2013 by the Schedule C, yes.
And then in box 13 for depreciation, is it correct that you list almost $58,000?
Yes.
And in box 17 for legal and professional services, you list roughly $22,000.
Yes.
And then going to box 21 for repairs and maintenance, around $69,000.
Yes.
And in box 25, your reported utility expenses about $37,000. Is that correct?
Yes.
And this was in 2014, before you started voluntarily limiting your diversion. Is that correct?
I can't say that's the case because I've been not running the diesel or the hydroelectric plant in the summer for much longer than 3 years.
But it was before you limited your
There's been
summer diversion to consumptive uses for the nymphs.
Let's clarify
flow, is
this.
that-
I have not run hydroelectric plant operations at all in the last year and a half, 2 years, based on the legal issues. I have voluntarily turned off hydro plant generation in the summer for much, much longer.
But have you previously testified that starting around 2015, you started diverting less water voluntarily in response to the NIMS recommendations?
Year-round, yes.
Okay. So, and did this lead to greater reliance on the diesel generator?
Yes.
Okay. So you would have consumed more diesel fuel?
If I'm not running the hydroelectric plant at all, the only other power source for me is the diesel power plant. I don't have access to the grid. I don't have a solar system. I don't have any other system. So it's either diesel or it's hydroelectric in power. Also, I might add that the sum total of these numbers may or may not reflect anything on the ratios of fuel consumption, because I can't tell you what else is included in that sum total number.
Well, right now I'm just asking you about this
Yeah.
number, and perhaps we can get into that later.
Yeah.
And that year, your net profit, it's in box 31, that was $1,195, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then we'll go up to page 22. Is this your 2015 tax return?
It is.
Okay. It looks like, this no longer looks like a Schedule C. Is that correct?
Yes, this is a return for an S corporation. We changed our business profile from, we've had an evolution from an LLC to a DBA and then to an S corporation. So the
Okay.
schedules and the reports have changed to meet the legal parameters of those different business forms.
Okay, and in box 6 for your Net income, you reported $623,000 roughly.
$627,000. Oh, box 3, yes, 623.
I think it's box 6.
Yes,
Okay, thank you. And box 9, repairs and maintenance, is it correct that you reported $58,000 roughly?
well, I can't tell what box 9 represents, but that's the number there.
Okay. And your total deductions in box 20 were $708,000?
Correct?
Okay. And I'm going to ask about line 14. Unfortunately, this copied poorly. Do you know if this would represent depreciation?
Not a clue.
Okay. But the number is $186,000?
The number does read 186, apparently 804 or 904.
Okay.
I can't really tell either.
All right. And then go in box. I'm trying to find one that's more readable. Your ordinary business income, you report a loss of $85,000. Is that correct? And that is line 21.
Can you make that a little bit bigger for me so I can see that?
Of course.
Ordinary business income. Yes, that's what that reads.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay. But your overall income here, goods, services sold, $627,000. Is that more than the previous year?
This is the 2015 year we were looking at?
Yes.
And the 2014 had 400 and some, is that accurate?
The 2014 year had, I think, $474,000.
I would agree that $627,000 is more than 400 and something thousand dollars.
Excellent. Okay, so then I think we go to page 88. Do you recognize, is this your 2016 return?
Yes, it is.
Okay, fortunately, this one's a little easier to read. And here in box 1, where it says gross receipts of sales, is that in excess of $750,000?
It is.
And that's more than 2015?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Would you agree that the increase is roughly $126,000?
Over what year to what year?
From the prior year.
So the prior year was what?
623,000.
So yeah, roughly.
Okay. And ultimately, you reported a loss of $137,000. Is that correct?
Yes. Can I ask what year this is again?
This is 2016.
Okay.
Yeah, 1 hour has gone by, so at this point, how much more time do you think you need to resolve this line of questioning?
Maybe 5 minutes. Okay.
I'll allow that.
All right. So I'd like to go to your energy cost estimates in Exhibit 19. You had this estimate from the electrician. Is it correct that this is for an interconnected system?
Give me just a moment.
Okay. I mean, does this quote describe the system as interconnecting with your existing hydro system?
Yeah, I just read the first
Okay.
paragraph, and that's accurate.
And it operates in conjunction with a battery?
I don't know that. Let me look. Yes.
Okay. And it indicates that the hydro system would be available for winter use?
I don't know. Let me see this. Where does it say that?
In that highlighted portion?
Okay, yes.
Okay. And does this quote indicate that it would be sufficient to meet the ranch's power demands?
Can you show me where it says that? Because I don't know where it says that.
Can you read that highlighted portion?
This new system is the minimum size necessary to cover energy consumption of the 126,265.68 kilowatt hour a year. See attached by Marble Mountain Ranch Resort.
And do you recall Mr. Howard's testimony yesterday that this system would likely allow the ranch to operate year-round with a lower peak diversion, at a lower peak diversion rate?
Actually, I don't recall that. I'll accept that he said that, but I don't recall him saying that.
Fair enough. And then I'd like to go to this second estimate from Mr. I think it's Hal Slater.
Right.
He talks about, this is a larger solar system, and he talks about the financing. Does he indicate that the loan for this would run roughly about $4,000 a month? Can you read the highlighted portion, please?
These loans are simple to obtain, but typically have higher rates, probably around $4,000 a month for 20 years.
Okay. And is it correct that the warranties for this system ranged from 20 to 25 years, depending on the parts of the system that are warranted?
I don't know that. Can you highlight that so I can agree or disagree?
Can you read this sentence, please?
Okay. You may choose from either Solar World or LG for the solar panels, both of which have 25-year warranties.
Okay. And then can you read this highlighted sentence, please?
These two are the only technologies that offer a 20-plus year warranty on the batteries like the PV panels have.
Okay.
He's waiting for a competitive quote from a manufacturer of flow batteries. Okay.
Okay. And then I'd like to go back down to his discussion of costs.
Mm-hmm.
And is it correct that he indicates you could probably pay this system off and own it within 8 years?
If you can use the tax benefits, you could probably prepay the loan as you recover them and own it within 8 years.
Can the record reflect that Mr. Cole is reading from the exhibit? Thank you.
I didn't finish. Did you want me to finish that?
Sure.
If you can use the tax benefits, you could probably prepay the loan as you recover them and own it within 8 years or less, or use the tax savings to grow the business.
So $4,000 a month, is that roughly equal to your diesel expense at times?
If the only expense is payment on a system, and that's the number assigned to the diesel at the time, yes.
And
if there's no other considerations involved, then they're roughly equal numbers.
And let's say this system meets your power needs. You pay it off in 8 years. Would you still have to pay for it once it's paid off?
I don't have to make payments on it. Doesn't mean don't have to buy new batteries or do maintenance on anything. According to this projection that he's made, it would be paid off in some length of time. There is no analysis of the operation expense of it or the future maintenance of a photovoltaic system with batteries, especially on a commercial installation. This is only an evaluation of an initial installation.
But it's a warranted system, is that correct?
It appears to have warranties on the solar panels And I think we read that the batteries are also included in a warranty system of
Yeah,
some sort.
and how long are the warranties?
I'm reading 20 years.
Okay. And what's the warranty for the solar panels? I will highlight that sentence.
25.
So if you pay it off in 8 years, how many years, and at that point you own it,
Yeah.
assuming the warranty covers maintenance costs, how many years would you have without additional payments for a system such as this?
With no other considerations, whatever the difference is between 20, 25 years and the payoff of 8 years. So presuming we could use tax deductions and there were no other factors involved, then that's the number.
So it does that based on a 20 to 25 year warranty and an 8-year payoff. Is that roughly 12 to 17 years without payments?
I presume so. I haven't done the head math.
I'm a lawyer. I have a hard time doing the math myself.
Okay.
And given that my time's expired, those are my questions. Thank you.
I just wanted to quickly clarify that last line of questioning was MMR 19, correct?
It was MMR 19, and specifically the last line of questioning was on page 3 of the exhibit.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Counselor. And time check is about 4:33 p.m. We can continue. The next potential questioner is National Marine Fisheries Service. Do you have any questions for Mr. Cole? Yes. Please approach. Yeah. So I wanted to just do, on the time check, how long roughly do you think your line of questioning will take?
Less than 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I guess I've been advised we have a pretty hard stop at 5 o'clock, so we'll be watching this as we approach it.
Can I pick up my bottle of water, please?
Yes, go right ahead. Thanks for asking. Very considerate. Okay, Counselor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Cole.
Good afternoon.
I have just a couple questions for you. Do you recall testifying under questioning from Mr. Petrozelli that you have basic science degrees?
That's correct.
What is your full educational background?
A bachelor's degree from UC Davis in zoology and 2.5 to 3 years of graduate work in cellular biology, studying the sperm-egg interactions of the African clawed frog, Xenopus laevis.
You've also testified that you purchased the ranch in 1994. How would you describe your current occupation in running the ranch? Do you have a
Under what
job
terms?
title?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
If I were to ask you, or there were a form to fill out that asked your occupation, how would you describe it?
Depending on the person asking the question, I might respond that I'm a fly fishing guide, a whitewater river guide, a horse wrangler, a short order cook, a facilities maintenance operator, or it would depend on the person asking the question. My job hats are varied in many.
Would it be fair to roll that up into one rubric as owner-operator of a Dude Ranch guest
Sure.
ranch? Sure. What was your occupation in 1994, just prior to purchasing the ranch?
You're speaking to a serial entrepreneur. I had a whitewater rafting business called Access to Adventure, which operated on 13 different rivers across the West Coast, including the Klamath River, which is my original connection to this area. Speaking of Soames Bar. I had an interior design and contracting business called D&H Interiors, standing for Doug and Heidi, where we installed carpets, hardwood floors, ceramic tiles, draperies, wall coverings, upholstering items, and generally finish work of any type inside of a building, commercial and residential. I also taught high school science and math in Foothill Farms Junior High, Grant High School, Highlands High School, and ultimately continued teaching high school for a brief period at Happy Camp High School. I also was co-owner and operator of 2 fairly significant preschool and daycare facilities in Yolo County, New Generations, and In Our Care. All of those items were sold in order to fund the purchase of Marble Mountain Ranch.
Did you finance that purchase of the ranch?
The paper was carried in part by the owner, the previous owner. Now, let me think. I assumed a note that was left remaining from the Hayes family that was serviced by Bob and Judith Young. And I took assets from my previous businesses and also had contribution helps from my parents.
Did you have a professional appraisal done on the ranch and the value of the water right before you purchased it?
I didn't have any appraisal done. There was a business appraisal done by the by the seller in order to begin with the negotiating price for the sale of the ranch. I had nothing to do with that.
Did you have the assistance of counsel in carrying out the transaction, the purchase
I
of the
did
ranch?
not.
If I can just have a moment.
Yeah, take your time.
Did you conduct an inspection of the property before you purchased it, Mr. Cole?
Yes, I did.
Did your inspection include the point of diversion, the ditch, the water right that was associated with the property?
We did a quick walk of it, yes.
What was the purchase price for the ranch? What did you pay for it?
I'm not sure I can recall with 100% accuracy, but I can put you in the ballpark.
To the best of your
yeah.
recollection is what I'm looking for.
So please don't hold me to this, but it was in the range of 650,000.
I won't hold you to that. There's public records available in Siskiyou
Right.
County. Right. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Kuiper. Next, Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I'll repeat the question about timing. We have about 20 minutes till...
I'll try to be quick.
Okay, so it'll be less than 20 minutes.
It will.
Thank you.
Up on the screen is CDFW Exhibit 8. I'll represent that as a arrest investigation report prepared by Warden Boyd with the department on September 29, 2000. Have you ever seen this document, Mr. Cole?
I'm going to object, goes beyond the scope of his direct.
The contents of the...
overruled.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cross is not limited strictly to direct.
Just want to bring your attention to some statements by Mr. Boyd in the report to see if you agree with them or if you have any information to share about it. He says in the report, and I'm trying to find it, basically I'll represent that the report was in response to a complaint that Mr. Boyd investigated, finding the construction of a dam. And he reports that the dam was 3.5 feet tall, and that it diverted nearly all the surface flow down a long diversion ditch, and that's in reference to the ditch for Marble Mountain Ranch. He then made contact with you, and you went out to take a look at it, and you made some statements about, let's let's see, right here on line 16, that the amount of water needed to allow fish passage, which causes you severe financial burden, and you use the water to generate power for the property and business. Do you recall those statements or that encounter at all?
I don't recall the statements, but I accept them on the face of this document. I know Brian Boyd.
Okay. His statement that the dam was diverting nearly all the surface flow down a diversion ditch, at least at the time or even thereafter, is this a common occurrence?
Well, can I back up and ask if he addresses any of the return flow points in this document?
No, I didn't see any of that.
All right, to the degree that he does not address the 2 overflow weirs that were installed and in place immediately after we purchased the ditch and began diverting, I would agree with that caveat that if that's what he wrote, except for he neglected to include those items.
Just to restate my question, regardless of whether the flow is being returned to the creek or not, is it a common occurrence for you or Marble Mountain Ranch to operate the dam in such a way that it diverts nearly all the surface flow of the creek into the ditch?
Could you put a time frame in that question?
Yeah.
Either in 2000 or thereafter.
The operation of the berm to capture water, we were more aggressive in the early days. After contact with Brian Boyd and his comments, we allowed for fish passage.
Okay.
I mean, in a more direct way. I mean, we presumed that, I had a discussion with him and said, well, what is fish passage? And he, if I can remember the conversation, told me what minimum would be required for a fish to get down the stream, which wasn't a whole lot, but it was a notable thing that had to be installed into the berm or maintained in the berm. And so as nebulous a passage as nebulous a comment as fish passage was, we did have a discussion on what that meant so that we could comply.
Thank you.
Counsel, before we move off this document, can you just state the exhibit number again for that?
Yes,
court
it's
reporter?
CDFW 8.
CDFW 8.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cole, on page 3 of your testimony, offered into evidence as exhibit MMR-1, you state that you divert some water from Stanshaw Creek into a small pond on the ranch for non-consumptive purposes, including, quote, fish and wildlife. How is the pond used for fish and wildlife?
Well, it's habitat. And so we have waterfowl visiting. We have predators that live on that pond, so it's providing habitat. And, as you would normally expect at the refusal pool at the end of Stanshaw, minus the salmonids of concern. So in every other regard, it's a habitat issue.
When you say fish, do you mean both fin fish and non-fin fish, like amphibians, for example?
The ranch is loaded with frogs.
Okay. Of the fish that are in the pond, are any fish not stocked?
I don't think so, unless a fish could survive a migration from Stanshaw Creek, down the ditch, through the trash rack, down the penstock, through the water wheel, down the lower ditch line, and into the ditch. So that would be an unlikelihood.
Okay, that leads to my next and last question, which is on pages 2 and 3 of Jennifer Bull's testimony offered into evidence as exhibit CDFW-1. Ms. Bull explains that she visited the ranch on May 14th, 2015, and during that visit she observed fish in the pond on the ranch that appeared to her to be salmonids based on their markings, and she recounts that she told you, she recounts that later you told her that the fish in the pond came from Stanshaw Creek. Is this statement accurate? Could fish in the pond in some way originate from Stanshaw Creek?
If they could survive that journey, then they could,
Do you recall
hypothetically.
Okay. Do you recall making the statement to Ms. Bull?
I do not.
Okay. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. As we near 5 o'clock, next on the list would be the Karuk tribe. If you could, if your questions would be 10 minutes or less, we could continue with the proceeding right now. Yeah, if you're not sure, due to the nature of the hard stop at 5, we would then suggest that we call recess and reconvene tomorrow morning.
I mean, that's fine with me.
Okay.
I'm good to go. Let's keep going.
Mr. Coles, he's all warmed up.
I need to get home.
I do too, but I think that just to ensure continuity through the whole process that we extend till tomorrow.
Okay, yes, that's the wise and prudent, though not most desirable course of action. So at this point, I want to thank everyone for their participation and hard work today. We'll recess the proceeding and reconvene tomorrow. Once again, I'm going to set a time of 9:30 a.m. to begin tomorrow, and we'll have the room till 5 o'clock, I believe, just like today. And so those will be the time frame for tomorrow's hearing. So we'll reconvene here at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.